Okay, we're going to get started in a minute or two. I know people are still over in the eating lunch, I guess, or we're networking or whatever you want to call the talking that they're doing. What we're going to try to do as much as we can is cut the breaks a little shorter or eliminate them so we can get out a little bit earlier as well. So you guys can get on the road a little bit earlier too, because it does get dark by almost 5:30. So who here has the longest ride home? And how long? 4 hours. Does anybody have more than 4 hours? Where do you go?
Connecticut.
Oh, you really have a ride. And she has to sort of go through the New York area, so that's even worse. So, but if that's okay with you, we'll try to do that. But obviously, if you need to use the facilities or take a break or a phone call, feel free to do that at your leisure. So our next presentation right after lunch today is titled Ease of Doing Business, Streamlining the Agent Experience While Maintaining Underwriting Quality. And I'm really interested to hear this because, trying to reduce friction in the agent space with the customer, with the company is always a big issue. And especially in the independent agent world where they have many choices as well. So it'll be interesting to hear what you have to say. So we have Jess Butler, raise your hand. Yes, from Mutual Capital Analytics, and John Pelka, did I say that correctly? Chief Underwriting Officer at Tuscarora, Oanh. You have a pretty long ride too. It's 2.5, 3 hours, isn't it? Yeah. So, but anyway, they're going to be leading this discussion. I'm assuming it's you also want it as interactive as you can. All right. So if you do have comments, questions, or anything as we're doing it, I'll try to get you the microphone so that once again, our friends at wherever they're watching us from, welcome again, can hear what you have to say. So with that, I'm going to turn this mic over to you, and it's all yours. All right. Do you want me to read your bio? You want your bio read?
I can do my intro.
I forgot to ask you earlier, so I felt obligated to ask. So thank you.
Thanks. Thanks for having us this afternoon. Can everyone, you can hear okay? I don't want to, okay, good. I'm Jess Butler with Mutual Capital Analytics. I joined MCA about probably the end of 19, right as it incorporated. And prior to that, I was at Travelers for 16 years. And I spent 8 years in personal lines, 8 years in small commercial across pricing, the product, process, technology, sat in an underwriting center from a commercial lines perspective. So a lot of different backgrounds and perspectives. And I say that because when I joined Mutual Capital Analytics, I joined because all the stuff that I got to do at Travelers, I actually get to do now with all mutual clients. And so Mutual Capital Analytics is a dedicated company to the mutual space to help bring innovation, analytics, and data to the mutual industry. And so one of our clients, John Pelka at TW, we've been working a lot with from a data and analytics perspective. And I thought it would be nice, we thought it would be nice to kind of come and share our experience on how we're kind of taking friction out of the process for an agent, but not giving up the underwriting quality and how to actually do that. So we're going to actually walk through one of the frameworks in which we can streamline or have, I'm sure everybody's heard the buzzword straight through processing, right? And so how do we actually have an application of straight through processing? What does that mean? How do you do it? And then how does it have what is the outcome of it? And so very tangible components there. So John.
I'm John Pelka, Chief Underwriting Officer for Tuscarora, Oanh. I feel like I'm playing rock band here. Not used to a mic. Been in this role for about 2 years. I've been in the industry for about 20. Underwriting, marketing, management roles. About half of that time was with the mutual space. The other side is more in the national, semi, or super regional carrier side. So have plenty of breadth of experience in terms of working on the small mutual side, understanding you have limited resources really from from what you can do and bring to the table to create efficiencies and dedicate time and allocate resources toward more, research and analysis around, straight through processing, ease of doing business, predictive analytics, all that kind of stuff. But also experience with some of the larger carriers too. So I've seen, kind of what works, what definitely don't do on the, how to roll things out to be perceived in the market. Don't take the pen out of the underwriter's hand. I think that's the biggest piece for me as CUO is we want to maintain underwriting discipline, but also underwriting relationship with our independent agency partners. It's not all about straight through all the time. There are good times and good reasons to definitely push more of that, but there's also great reasons why you don't want to necessarily go down that path 100% of the time. So, from Jess's role with MCA, they really helped us not just look at data and analytics from a predictive modeling or analytics standpoint per se. That's, some people may have that kind of misconception. You can utilize that data and that analysis to really make better informed decisions on how to just improve efficiency and streamline the process.
Yeah. And so as we think about straight through processing, and we wanted to take a step back and look at where the target usage for this concept is. And so a lot of the perception is, well, if you're going to do straight through processing, you're going to remove underwriting from the process. And that's really not the case. What we're doing is we're trying to actually get the underwriters back to where they want to spend the time on the more complex risks, on the little bit more tougher, the higher complexity risks. And the higher premium accounts versus really where you see on the left-hand side is really the low complexity risks, the policy premiums, quoted premiums that come through, that there's a higher volume there. And so as you think about ease of doing business, it's definitely where's the volume play that you want to have and how do you create efficiencies in that volume play? And then really allowing either you increase your authority or you be able to really focus your underwriters on developing more of that relationship, right, John? So having underwriting, working closer with the agents on some of this versus those low touch accounts of like $500 accounts day in and day out. It's a little bit of job function is a little bit more fulfilling too as we think about straight through processing. So again, we're not trying to do straight through processing for everything. There's definitely a targeted place in which this concept makes a lot of sense from an efficiency play.
And I think there's a fine line too, as we balance between straight through processing and where underwriters need to allocate more time. I'll speak for the Tuscarora Oanh side. We've been a very high touch company for a very long time. Underwriters do everything. For a long time up until earlier this year, all of our underwriters did all personal lines, all farm, all commercial. They handled their own claims, or at least claim setup. They did their own marketing. So we've done some restructuring around some of that. But the reason we did some of that was as a result of some of the analysis that Jess's team was able to help us out with to enable us to make better informed decisions to say, you know what, we are not utilizing our resources to their highest and best talent. So we had to make some decisions and, change is tough. Underwriters, as much as they would say, why do I need to handle these small endorsements and things? Why do I need to look at that claim file? The second we said, all right, you're not going to need to do that anymore. They're like, whoa, don't take that away from me. How am I going to manage that book? I was like, and that's the point. You're going to manage the portfolio. You're not going to manage every single policy. And that's a change and it's a transition for us as a small group.
So as we think about a straight through processing strategy, really looking at it from end to end. A lot of folks think about it, and terminology is important. If you ask 5 people at your company what straight through processing is, you'll probably get a different answer for every single one. Is it the UI questions and I just need to streamline that? Is it the underwriting referral rules that trigger and I remove some of those and do those differently? Is it, do I have more pre-fill? Do I ask my supplemental questions rather than having a separate app later on? Do I have it in my process? Yes, the answer is yes. All of those go to straight through processing. So scope is really important. So as you think about the key to a straight through processing, agent experience and streamlining that question set is absolutely critical. I think that the second part here is the rules management and analytics. Quote data, I'm not sure how many folks in this room have seen any quote data, but looking at your quote data and your portfolio and your profiles of business is business critical to this strategy. And the reason we say that is because you're not going to allow stuff to go through without an underwriter looking at it. You at least want to look at it from a data perspective before those accounts get to your loss ratio later on. Your quote data is really your windshield into what your losses are going to be in the future. And how do you actually use that quote data to drive what rules you now should be referring from a profile mix perspective. All of a sudden you're allowing business to be issued by an agent and your quote profile changes. You don't want to wait 2 years until that gets to your loss ratio. You want to know that week 2 when that happens. So your rule management, I say rule meaning your referral rule, is really important. And being able to have those analytics, I think from a validation perspective, right now you have the underwriter validating it. Think about how to do it differently. It'd be really third-party data validation. How do you trust but verify what that agent's saying with third-party data? Whether you do that on the front or the back, meaning after they issue, is still, you can play around with that. But as you think about third-party data validation, pre-fill is really important. Post-issuance review process. So you don't want to set it and forget it. You want to be able to watch all your quote data go through. And then you also want to understand, do I need some post-issuance underwriting? And so as you think about and you talk with underwriters, maybe you're not doing everything pre-issuance, maybe you're doing some post-issuance. The word audit has a bad connotation, but it's really, how do you have like post-issuance underwriting to make sure, either it's a targeted portfolio of the book that you want to look at. You opened up a little bit and you're really nervous about it, so you want to watch it closely on that back end. It's a way for your organization too, with change management, to really get comfortable with straight through processing. So encourage, that to kind of occur as well. And then from a communication perspective, internal and external, everybody knows when communication goes poorly, because everybody talks about how bad the communication was, but nobody talks about how great the communication was when it goes well. And so how are you communicating to your agency force about what business you want? And how are you actually communicating to your underwriters about, we're not replacing, we're actually moving some of the smaller stuff from a volume perspective off your plate? And what is that communication message from your leadership team looking like? So as we see it, we're kind of working through with TW and some other clients we have, these are all the components that we walk through with a straight through processing strategy and ease of doing business. Any questions, or so far so good?
I would just say, I think as this group, I'm sure us as a company, we've always been pretty good about getting policy and claim data. We have to, right? We got to report on all that kind of stuff. But also from an analysis standpoint, we're good on, sorry, the question? Oh, yep, sorry about that. From a policy and claim data standpoint, we're pretty good. But some of what we're going to see in some of the moving forward slides is that importance of the quote data enabled us to take logical, well thought out steps forward, which we're still going through some of that journey to really implement, but we're on the right path at this point to promote straight through processing, ease of doing business, but also attracting, why we're missing out on certain kinds of business, and that's going to other carriers. And also, especially on those higher loss ratio lines of business, why are we writing the business we are writing and missing out on this other stuff, where the quote data can really help support some of that and back it up.
So the first thing in walking through or starting a straight through processing strategy, as you guys are influencing leadership or you are in leadership, is really setting the scope. It can be a lot of things, and set the scope. I would encourage you to set it small. You know why? How many like to backtrack stuff with agents and say, oh yeah, we opened it up, but now we're going to close it down, right? So you're not going to do that. So how do you start? Hey, we're looking at straight through processing, and we want to be able to do one, we know we really do well in this from a profitability perspective. We want to, it's a smaller premium side. So how do we actually get more of that straight through? So, and as you're setting that direction, it needs to be in parallel with, you know, what are your agent expectations? What's the marketplace doing? I'm not sure if anybody I would love to be able to issue daycare straight through. Okay, you do some market research. There's very few doing that. Maybe not the ideal place to start. So where that might not be a profitable line for you. So how do you kind of have that marketplace perspective? Underwriting product knowledge is critical to making sure you're not opening up too wide and making sure you have the right exposures there that are available and you can learn about them. There's third-party data potentially available. Rating sophistication. You never want to open up distribution and allow agents to issue if you don't feel really comfortable with your rating and your pricing on your book. Availability of resources. There is work to do on a business side as well as a technology side for straight through processing. And so positioning that. The other thing to take in mind is, as you set the scope, there's really 3 different parts like of the business that your life cycle that you're in. You're either launching a new product, you want to redesign your platform, or you really want to keep it, but you want to just tweak it a little bit. And it's important to understand which one of those you want to focus on so that you can then design the work and the strategy and what you want to implement, design towards that. Because doing technology for redesign, you're going to move screens, you're going to move questions from one screen to another. That's not easy. Seems easy, but it's not that easy, right? And so is that going to be within scope? And so really trying to address what is the box you're going to play in? What's the segments you're going to play in that's profitable? And then how much movement of stuff do you want to do? Do you want to move where you make referral rule or decline, where you run some of your decline rules? I want to run those all up front. Okay, that's very different than if you're going to leave them running where they are and you're just going to add additional information in, or you're going to subtract information out. So point of the story is just set its scope small, and then also keep in mind to, as you're developing it, how you have extendability to other industries, other segments, other items. Make sense?
Yeah, and I think keeping the scope small to start also reduces volatility, you know, as far as that transition and change management. It enables you to manage it, you know, easier for sure.
This was an example of setting the direction I had with one of the clients is kind of, we're going to maintain the existing experience, maintain where referral rules are set, maintain the screen flow, limit changes, maintain our third-party data integration calls, build it for a very small set of book with extendability, and then allowing agents to bind a specific set of quotes. And so it seems very simple, but this simple is sometimes hard. Getting folks on some guiding principles around what it is you're trying to do with straight to processing, because it can be so large, is just important. So this was just more an example. All right, so I'm COO, so it's like, how do we do stuff? Like execution is what I live and breathe every day. So I wanted to talk about the execution of how you actually go through developing straight through processing as one framework. So one of we always start with the end-to-end, the current state assessment of what it is your business does from what's your pricing plan? You know what that tells us? What questions do you need to ask to rate a policy, right? What questions, what IRPM is available? Are you going to offer that IRPM or some portion of that to an agent? How complex is the pricing program? Is it profitable, and can we get to segments that we want to get to? So we kind of do the pricing plan review. The next thing is kind of the data review. And of the 3 up here, I'd say quote data is most important. People generally know where they're profitable and not, and where they've written on business. Where's the quote data available? Is there quote data available? If not, it's there, it's somewhere. And just how do we get to it? The third thing is, how do you actually live quote in that platform? So walk us through, John walked us through a couple of different, okay, what are the screen? What's the screen flow? When do you validate that an agent is able to write in that state? When do you call out to a Lexus or a Verisk partner? When do you make an insurance score call? When do you collect information for classification? A lot of people collect the classification up front. I had one client collect it all the way at the back. So those are different because pre-fill is different then. Where are your decline pieces? So as you're going through and you're thinking your platform, you're like, oh, this creates a decline here. This creates a referral message here. That's important to know. So if you wanted to move declines around or you wanted to move referrals around, how would we do that? Just how does that system from a business perspective actually come together on your screens? If you say, I want to do pre-fill for the age of the building, but you don't make that call till the end and you ask the agent to put it in up front, then we need to figure out how we reconfigure that so that it can work. And the last part is sitting down with John and his group and saying, okay, you got a referral in for new business. Walk me through what you do. Help me understand. What do you send out a supplemental app? Is there additional questions you always ask regarding this type of risk? Are there websites that you go to do searches for? Are there reports you pull? Are there inspections you order? What are all those items that are required in order to do that from an underwriter perspective? What do you look at? And then we can figure out from these components, okay, we know what pricing information, we know what data we have and what it's telling us, we know where it's asked and called in the platform, and we also know what happens from a manual process afterwards. And when I say end-to-end current state, that's what I mean, like from that agent opening your app to quote, to when an underwriter presses the issue button and binds it, what are all those steps so that you can take a step back and actually look at it end-to-end and holistically versus I'm just going to do the question set. I'm just going to do the underwriting rules. So you see the difference is it's a little bit different.
So as you know, Jess and team went through that part, the quote process and the underwriting process, kind of knee-jerk reaction. I think we're all kind of tempted by that, is to say, oh, we can definitely fix this and this right away. Resist that temptation, go through the process. This is why we do it end to end. We've had some of that conversation as well. Like these screens just need to go. Like you kind of pause this a little bit and say, well, no, let's take a look at the whole process. Let's look at, line by line. Because the progression, this is a baseline, and then taking those next steps, which Jess will kind of walk through here soon, really set the stage for what your next steps are and what kind of direction you should take based on your tolerance, how much you want to go straight through, what you want underwriters to see. But obviously from an operations standpoint, there's ripple effect there. That's workflow, there's efficiency, there's agency, ease of doing business, and comfort level perspective. So I really encourage this process for me, as CUO, was something that I didn't do before. I thought it was extremely valuable going end to end.
Any questions? Just want to make sure. So I have, we kind of went through a deep dive on each one, and as we look at it, just kind of what are some of the questions that we look at and things we think about when we're going through a price plan. So here is a lot of like, what are the data elements available to rate the policy? What data is provided by an agent versus a third party? Again, the data validation is important. So just kind of getting a level set. Do underwriters deviate from manual pricing? And if so, what's kind of the basis? What are some of the IRPM components that are in there? And how do they use them? What's the documentation? How do we normally deviate? And just getting a sense for it. And then what we've done is we can actually look at it from a data perspective and from a quote production and loss ratio data and say, hey, we're actually seeing it in the data, or actually we deviate a little bit here, and we probably need to understand more so that we don't want to disrupt flow. We want to make sure there's still all the levers available in it. And so just making sure we have a really good understanding of it. This was something I walked John and his team through
and I'm sure you can't see all of it, but what I call this is really the assembly line. You have an agent that's going to your platform. Their intention is to issue a piece of business. There are things in that process that stop them from issuing that business. What this does is it actually tells you during their journey where it falls off. Does it fall off in declines? Does it fall off in referrals? Do they abandon quote? Meaning they don't like your question set or how it's positioned. And so as we think about it, you always want to try to get for, well, let's see if I can do this here. Okay, so for one, what's preventing policy? So this says quoted started at 100 and we have rated at about 80. Now, the easiest thing to do is the hardest thing to do is to go to an agent and say, hi, I need more quotes, right? What you can do is take what's already in your funnel and in your assembly line and change the outcome of it. And so all this slide is getting to is understanding your baseline of, hey, I actually have 20% of my business falling off. What decline rules are they hitting? And are those decline rules the correct intended decline rules? Some folks, we create some of the rules and the intention is not always carried out. For example, a client we went through and they said, well, no prior insurance. We don't want that. We don't want any lapse in coverage. Makes complete sense. And I looked at the data. We're issuing 99% of all of our no prior insurance. And if you looked at it, it was because they were mostly new ventures. And this client was very comfortable with new ventures. So how do you actually change your decline logic to put more through the funnel? So you're not doing anything more with your external partners. You're really just changing your internal process. The other one here is increased straight through eligibility. So some of them, so this is rated and not rated. And this meaning it's declined usually. And then here is straight through processing eligible is usually, we see about, and there's this concept of internal and external I kind of created. A lot of folks feel straight through processing and there's two perspectives out there. I start 100 and I issue 10 as an agent. That's a 10% straight through processing perspective from an agent. Internally, you got a quote straight through processing eligible is 30 and I issued 10. That's 10 of 30. That's a lot higher percentage. That's an internal number. If you're looking at how you want to make your process better for your end customer and for customer centricity, really focusing on what's that agent perspective of straight through. You can still talk to your board of directors and other folks internally about how you want to be 50% straight through, meaning of the ones that are issued, what's available. But really keeping in mind that external perspective is how you're going to drive change in your new business numbers over the course of this. So what referral messages are most triggering to slow down your straight through processing? So far, so good.
And those referral messages, that's captured in that quote data. You know, all the rating data, the risk data, but also the underwriting questions that if one of our agents actually got through, rated it, submitted it, completed the underwriting process, all of those questions are part of that quote data set. So just want to bring that back to kind of level. You know, we're all family here. I won't lie. This is an actual TW case study. This is a high profit margin line for us. And we thought we were doing okay from straight through processing, fairly homogenous kind of book. You know, I'm not going to tell you exactly what it is. Don't want to give away all the secrets. But a line we're very comfortable with that we write day in, day out. We have pretty good flexibility. We have great response. We have a decent product, and we're making money. So from our perspective, like Jess said, you know, we thought our straight through rate was okay, but you know, looking at the data and then validating that with agency experience conversations, it's like, you guys, you know, I don't get nearly, you know, as much put through you guys that I can on my side as I do with carrier X. So again, perspective is everything, especially when you're dealing with a customer that's going to feed you your business. But then also, you know, sometimes it pays to take a hard look at your own information and say, you know what, we are failing here. And this was an actionable item for us, and it's one we're moving on right now.
So live coding of the platform. I'm a math major and I love this part of it.
She's bragging.
I love it. And I was process of efficiency, operations, research, concentration. So being able to combine the analytics with how this is being processed in your platform, and then being able to take them and think about each one of these bullets as like a sticky note on a piece of paper. And you can move it around and think about how you move it around based on where your data calls are coming, where you want to do, your pre-fill, when you want to make certain referral calls. So what are actually the names of each screen, and what is the information collected on each screen? You generally know, but like taking pen to paper, writing it down, and you can see what's that process? Oh, we actually have to go back to this screen to answer these other questions in order to issue the policy. Is that the best experience? Or should we move that sticky note to a different spot so that it's a smoother experience? Is it when you pull up you press next and you go to the next page, is it all red for the agent and they've never seen this page before, but it just starts out all red? How's that experience feel, right? And so getting all of that information is really just documenting this in a very, this is how we do it. Just what is the process flow for this? And where's all the navigational components to it? The next part is once it comes in, it's referred or it's issued, and we go through both of those. If it's referred, what does the underwriter do with it? And how can we make it so that they don't have to touch it if it's one of those target guiding principle components of scope that you set early on that you want to focus on? This is really just a manual workflow of that same piece of business. And all we're doing is taking that piece of business, walking it through all the screens, walking it through all the handoffs and all of the actions that an underwriter does so that you can see, again, where do you want to move some sticky notes here? If there's a supplemental app and you ask the same 6 questions on every single restaurant risk that has, their same 6 questions, what level are the questions? Are they policy? Are they building? Are they location? Where would they fit on that prior screen, given what question you're asking, right? So I need to know what are all the questions you're asking, what levels they are, so I can then compare it to the quote screen to say, where could you ask it, where it would make sense from an experience perspective. So you start by defining that end-to-end current state from data and quote experience of an agent all the way through that last handoff of the underwriter issuance process. And now you have a really great baseline to say, all right, this is, okay, now let me go back to my scope. I'm only going to do a couple things. What do I want to do and what's most impactful? So we did those 4 disparate pieces of research. They don't take very long. I think each one was about an hour and a half, and conversation with folks. And then we put together some artifacts and sit down and go through John, and it's really putting it together. How do you take those 4 disparate pieces of information we went through? The data, the pricing plan, the screens, and the workflow of an underwriter, and how do we actually optimize that process and that screen flow?
So, as a result of that, and like I mentioned before, some of that quote data that we captured, these are some examples of those artifacts. To say, we ran, 5,000 quotes through. This is how much data we have on these specific underwriting questions. And this is how they were answered. Was it yes or no? Was it, an option type field where, for this particular line of business, I don't know if you can see them up there, but the two first questions are, is the building retrofitted for earthquake, and is the residence in a gated community? So 100% of the time, agents answered those no. And from an underwriting perspective, I validated this with my team. What are you doing with those if they're answered yes? Nothing. All right, that's an easy one. But the fact is, we've been, like I mentioned before, a very traditional underwriting company, very, very high touch, very, I won't say rigid, but, thorough from an underwriting perspective, asking the right questions. And a lot of our structure has been built around Accord applications that, kind of ask the world and more. Half of it might be pertinent, half maybe not. But this is just one of those examples where it's, all right, that's a kind of a useless question for this particular line of business, for this particular risk. So that's an easy one that we can make an actionable decision on. Question 3, a little bit different. Are there any other residents not listed on the application that are owned or occupied or rented outside of the state? So a little bit more differential there in terms of how that question was answered. And we would also handle that a little differently from an underwriting perspective. Could be, perhaps an indication of absentee landlord or, other things to perhaps ask the agent about, to say, hey, sounds like the insured has other properties. Is there opportunity for us on those too? So you can turn those into opportunistic questions. But at the end of the day, what are we going to do with those? In some cases, we'll remove those entirely, being not valuable to anyone, streamline the process for both agents and underwriters. The third one, we'll kind of keep that question in there because we feel there's some value, at least today, for underwriting to say, we're not comfortable letting that one go yet. And again, scope, right? Keep it small. Don't flip your world upside down. And then that last question is the building under construction. Again, a little bit, smaller deviation as far as how the question is answered. But we also looked at that to say, what are we asking for as underwriters? What are we really trying to get at with that? And that wasn't necessarily coming across in that context to our agents who were answering it. We may have meant one thing by it, but agents were perceiving it in another way. So we said, you know what? We think there is value with that, but we need to reword that. Let's just not use the canned, Accord application question. Let's customize some things here, get very, much more specific in terms of what we want from an underwriting perspective, just bring clarity to the process. So that's one where, we're going to keep it, but change the verbiage a little bit and have different context attached to it.
Yeah. So John and I had a little bit of fun doing this. I did all this work with only data. And John did this work with only underwriting background, not looking at the data. And then we got together and said, what do we want to do? Let's go through our answers and see where we mostly overlapped and where we had differences. And so one of the number 3 came out as I would have got rid of it. And you don't live 100% by data, right? And John's like, yeah, no, we can't get rid of that one. And here's why. And so, okay, that makes total sense. Let's keep it in. Let's do some rule analytics on it to understand, is the intent getting there? Same thing with the last one. And so we did it both ways in parallel and came together. So not one outweighing the other, but really more of a compromise throughout the process.
And I think, ironically, for the most part, we were pretty close in terms of, what the data suggested and what we would say as an underwriting department to say, yeah, we probably don't need that, or yeah, keep it, or maybe we need to revisit that, how that's posed.
Some of the escalations are very small volumes from a data perspective, but create like high severity components from an underwriting side. Those were probably the most different in the 2 processes as we went through.
So it was good that we did match up because that helped some of the change management. The underwriters weren't saying, oh, you can't take that away.
Yeah.
We didn't have too many of those. So it was validating.
So the first slide was, what are all the questions on the UI that we want to look at? And which ones do we want to really retain, remove, or reword? The second part is the rule management and analytics. You need to ask questions on your UI in order for rules to run for declines and referrals. So this was an example with a different client where they had the no prior insurance rule running, and everybody it had an extremely high hit ratio where the number 1 is at 28. So the book is running about a 16 hit ratio, and this one was almost double. this portion of the book, any rule that hit this rule, a ton were being issued, but it had to go through an underwriter. And so, we looked at it, it was very prevalent in one state. That's where number 3 is. Number 2 is it really only had a single referral. So other than, it actually technically had 2, so it had a high volume and it was very heavy to the contractor class. And so what we noticed was in the data, anything that had no prior insurance. So no prior insurance, the intent of that rule is to capture the lapse in coverage. What they were capturing with this rule was actually, it was just new in business. And so they're fine if it's new in business and it didn't have insurance, but they're not fine if it had a lapse in coverage. So what we did was reworded the rule to include if less than 3 years experience. And it actually freed up over 20% of the capacity for an underwriter, given the amount of referrals they had for those couple underwriters, because it was very concentrated on a state-by-state basis. So this is what we do is this little on the left-hand side, we look at those analytics for every single rule, and you start with your top hit rules and you kind of go down until you get to a lower amount. So yeah, you could refine the rule. You could review, your small contractor loss ratios for profitability. The client felt comfortable with those. And so we kind of moved those on. The next part, so you have your UI where you streamline those. The next one was you looked at all your declines and referral rules. And you feel good about what you should be asking and what you should be running, and you tweaked your rules. The next part is, how do I actually just not have the agent answer this question anymore? I already am connected to a Hazard Hub or a Veris product that offers me the age of building. Why am I asking for the agent to fill in age of building when I can just get it pre-filled? So when do you make the call in your screen flow to that third party? And what screen do you actually ask that question on? And can you actually remove it? Very, very simple, but if you have to move stuff around, that's when things get more expensive from a technology perspective, but figuring out how to make it live in it. So you have, okay, now you have your pre-filled components too.
And I'll just kind of chime in here from a risk data standpoint, whether it's policy and claim data, whether it's your quote data set, that use of third-party data, I would highly recommend. We all trust our independent agents, but sometimes, it's a best guess, right? On year of construction, or, maybe they don't see, that veneer siding as brick veneer. Maybe it's actually framed, but they rate it as joisted masonry, all that kind of stuff. Maybe the square footage is way off, where you have all that risk, that property information in particular. It's pretty, highly available in the market. Use that information, going through a system conversion on our side for 3 to 4 years, and a heavy property book as well. From a renewal standpoint alone, not just new business, but from a renewal standpoint, we're going through and we're like, did someone really love 1960? Like, did they have way too much fun back then? Because every one of these properties was built in 1960, but that was just kind of the choice that was made when we manually had to convert policies in 2 legacy systems ago to, the current legacy. So if you can apply that, especially on new business, it gives you a better view of new risk you're adding to your portfolio, even on a renewal basis. You can start to use that data, not necessarily for a straight through processing perspective, but there are ripple effects as far as analytics and potential impacts as far as what you're looking at with claims trends and age of building and all that kind of stuff. So highly encourage trusting that third-party data.
Yeah. The last part is, so you have your UI, you have your referral and decline rules that and then which ones you want to do pre-fill for. The next one is which are there actually questions you'd like to add into the platform to increase straight through processing? Might sound counterintuitive, but how do you get comfortable with it from an underwriting perspective? You likely will go a little bit larger before you go smaller. But so what are those questions and at what level? Again, you don't want to create a referral on every single building for a policy level question. And so how do you actually, so you don't drive your underwriters crazy with 28 of the same referral message for 28 different buildings. But
And this is a case, where TW kind of sees ourselves as more of a specialty carrier. We don't do Main Street business every day. We do kind of the weird stuff, agents find us for, where, reducing a lot of kind of the common accord questions that don't add a lot of value for us, but kind of baking in those supplemental questions we think is our secret sauce, as far as, what the best risk is for us and what we want that book to look like. That's where, that really pays dividends. You can build those in.
So now you have your current process for baseline, and you have pretty much all the questions, at least, that you want to ask in your platform. The next part that's really important is now you know what you want to ask. How are you going to ask it? So there's different ways, and from a user experience perspective, as you think about patterns, this is a quick education side, but there's question and pattern differences that are available in most of the platforms that the mutuals are on. So scenarios to consider. If you have questions that have answers for a single yes, no, or true, false, can you consolidate that question? So instead of saying, do you have a German Shepherd? Do you have a pit bull? Do you have a row house? You say, select any of the following. You went from something that required 6 different forced inputs by a user to something that requires an optional 6 inputs by a user. So the way these questions were prior was answer me a yes, no for every single question versus ask me once and let me select optionally. That's the how when I talk about how. The next part is you really don't want to have any more than 6 answers. So you don't want to have like this huge long list because it becomes overwhelming for the user. What you want to do is you want to have, I would say in general, max 5 or 6. If you are saying, do you do any of the following? Palatable from a reader perspective. The other one is, another consideration is if you have under 3 answers, yes, no, or unknown, there's different ways you can either default stuff or not default stuff. And if you default, then you don't require the user to input that answer. Those are different, right? So sometimes you want the user to default to answer this question from a claims perspective. You use the experience to require that, but then there's other ways in which you maybe default other ones that might be a lower priority. So you know what questions you want to ask, and now you're starting to figure out how you want to ask them. The last option is really like, say you have a whole bunch of options you can have, and you can only select one, or you have multiple answers. So you would be able to do kind of a select list, and you allow multiple select. So again, these 3 question patterns, very easy within the Insurance Now platform and some of the other, the Duck Creek, the Brightcore, a lot of those platforms. But it's just sitting down and thinking about, okay, here's all the questions I want to ask. Do I want to ask, is this under construction? Is this a row house? Is this, or do I want to say, just check any that apply?
And this process, you start to sit down with some of the underwriters in the room, and some fights will break out. Just give you one example, like has any coverage been canceled or non-renewed in the last 3 years? Do we default that to a no because we expect clean business? Or, the alternative, contrary thought in the room is, oh, hell no, we want to leave that. We need to make sure that agent is answering yes or no. Like, well, we streamline the question set. We think they're reading, and at the end of the day, we're going to validate it with loss runs. So, what is the right answer? I still don't think we ever came to a really good conclusion on that. I think there's still differing opinions.
I think we left that one.
Yeah, I think we did too. But there's a divide there. So there will be some conflict, when you're going through some of these questions. At the end of the day, you're making the best decision that you can, based on your own experience and what your risk tolerance is as a carrier.
And you don't want to lose any of the data behind the scenes. So every other question that you used to have itemized, whether it's new or it's a new question or not, if it's an older question, making sure you're mapping it to the same answer so you can keep that data set over time. very, very valuable. So at the end of the day, when John and I were kind of done with the work is, I think on the left-hand side was the before, and the right-hand side is the same set of questions, just we streamlined what, we streamlined how, and then we work with technology to kind of build some of the wireframes with it. So really removed, retained, and rewrote some of those questions. And your design should fit within your guiding principles. And that's why I kind of going back to the scope is really important, because you can get really overwhelmed with doing this for your entire book. Do you pick up a small portion of it and you start to build on the experience over time, which is what we're doing. We're actually starting with one portion of the book, creating a really great experience for that. Given that feedback, we're testing and learning with that portion of it, and then we'll push out with other segments, and created it in a framework that's extendable to other industries.
So pretty significant movement for us. The font was made intentionally small, so you couldn't see all the silly questions we asked before. But you can see, I mean, it's laborious to go through all of those questions. And a lot of it was unused information from an underwriting perspective, but it was tailored. You know, there's a reason for it. We kind of tailored it off of the Accord application. So, you know, there was logic when we built this new system and said, all right, we're going to do this. But taking that from, you know, A to now, I won't say we're at Z yet, but we'll say Y. We haven't really implemented yet, but you can see it's such a huge impact. Just from a visual standpoint, you know, this screen, I think an agent had to actually scroll down like 4 pages worth just to get through it. It was just too much, and it wasn't necessary. So again, this is, you know, kind of the fruits of that labor to say, all right, this is what we just created. Underwriters feel good about it. They can sell that to an agent. Agents feel much more comfortable about going into the system. Now the hard part for us is convincing them to go back in the system and actually show them, you know, what came out of it.
Yep, and for these cards, we can figure out like when we run the referral rules at the end of the card, or do you wait to run all the review when you press this button? When do you save? Do you save? How annoying is it when the agent fills out the whole page and then they go and do something else and it doesn't save? You have saving functionality throughout the page. There's different things you can do. So once you've done what questions you want to ask, how you want to ask them, you need to set expectations. You have a small portion of your book that you set scope to, and really setting expectations as to what do you expect to happen from a resource capacity perspective so that you can measure success, and then also identify areas. So if you take how many quotes you have rated times your hit ratio, which really means how many did you issue over how many you quoted, you have issued policies. Multiply that times your average premium. That'll be the total new business dollars that'll now go through the pipe and stay on the conveyor belt versus coming off. And, you know, how do those change on your straight through processing, internal and external? You might not move the mark if you're starting really small to begin with, but maybe you identify, like for this industry, we're going to be 20, we're 0% today. We're actually going to be 20% external tomorrow once we launch this. Then you don't get nervous, right? So like you're telling management, hey, we're increased straight through processing. People tend to get nervous. If you say, hey, we expect about 20, we're at about 18. We feel really good about that. People feel, oh, okay, that feels better. So it's in hand. It's not getting out of control. You're watching it on the back end with data. The other thing is building out your post-issuance underwriting. I'd recommend for the first couple of weeks, underwriting 100% post-issuance. Just measure that level of underwriting quality. Helps you guys with your culture change, your change management, having your underwriter really understand, is it doing the intended outcome? It's more of, I would say, more of a change management component. And then what we'll do is we'll build out either a randomized, targeted, or balanced approach on how many we want to do. So if you say, hey, I want to do 15 a month or 15 a week, okay, what's the best way in which we want to do that? We can identify which ones have a high probability potentially of loss, or we can do a random generated sample, or You guys are nervous about an agent having the authority now. We can do a targeted sample of that. So just as you guys think about it, that's kind of how you create that program.
Or a specific agent having that.
Yeah. For
Everybody's
every,
got a couple.
and then you adjust rules as you kind of get some of the output. So you might say, hey, I actually need to tweak this rule because I'm seeing the profile for quotes shift. All right, so let's adjust that rule. And then also setting up some of the vendor vetting, you'll start to notice things going through that you're like, hey, I wish I had more validated data here or there. What vendors are available out there that we could potentially have for third-party data validation, costs, CPAs, things like that. Again, communication change management, a lot of education. We create a lot of education with TW in the underwriting group to make sure they're comfortable with everything that's kind of going on. And we support internal change management documents, FAQs, things like that to help with delivery of that message so that the message is consistent. It's clear. You want it to be this you just spent a lot of time on this. You want it to be a really exciting part. And so how do you kind of create that excitement through communication? And then kind of ongoing management. You don't want to set this and forget it, right? Because you'll find out in 2 years your loss ratio is a problem. So how do you just kind of watch it from a quote data perspective? Forget the rest of the slide. Okay. So we went through a lot of stuff and like how to begin, how to think about it. Setting up those guidelines and principles. Setting up your monitoring and quote data sets is critical to success for this. Your initial rules management, getting a baseline. If you don't know what your highest decline rule or your highest referral rule today, that's probably a good place to start with some of your quote data and trying to understand that. And if you had to tweak it, what would that actually create from a capacity perspective? Document the screens in the underwriter workflow. That's kind of current state. Then take a step back and say, okay, I got my data. I know which ones are my highest. I know all the questions I asked. Now, how do I start thinking about what do I want to be when I grow up? What's my scope for tomorrow? And how do I kind of work through that? So that's where we'd recommend to begin. And then again, we're just this is kind of the final slide of this, again, the straight through processing, and ease of doing business while we're maintaining that underwriting quality, really driven by, if you're not going to have an underwriter look at it, how do you start having data look at it on the front end, on your quote data, and augment with the underwriters on the back end for post issuance, but also really driving your underwriters to be getting those more complex risks over time, and growing your business really in both capacities, in the small policy premium space as well as the larger one. So our contact information is up there. I know we have like maybe 3 minutes left. Any questions from the room we'll start with? Home audience, what he said is I will repeat the question for the home audience when there's asked. I was just practicing. This will be deployed in February for TW. It's been deployed for another client, and we're doing post-issuance monitoring right now. And they created 23% capacity by changing 4 declination rules. And they were for 4 referral rules we tweaked. I just didn't do it. He wanted to know if this was deployed to anybody. I'm not sure how. Sure. So it's a lot of time. The question, how, what role also, because I still think it is graph. Yep. So yeah, I got it. So the question was, we spent a lot of time with the internal staff and understanding their feedback on what questions and how we should ask the questions. What input did we get from agents as we think about them as our end customer users, right? Great question. We did the work internally and then created wireframes, which essentially are mock-ups of how an actual platform would work. And we're either in process or just we're getting to it of going to agents and asking for their feedback on the wireframes before we're actually finished building it. So we're kind of doing it in parallel.
Yeah, so the one piece I'll add to that, so we have a select group of agencies that have been very candid with feedback. The candor is important, obviously. Constructive criticism, we love it. It's a gift. It's kind of a mantra here. Feedback is a gift at TW. The key to reaching back out to that group of agencies, I would highly recommend creating a dedicated beta group of agencies. So don't go out with the first iteration on wireframes and get their feedback. And then a month later, after you got that feedback, go pick a different set of agencies to give you more feedback. Keep that group as static as possible so you get kind of ongoing incremental improvement, refinement, and more consistency across that. We're confident. We've heard from our agency principals as well for that small group of agencies that's definitely the way to go, and we will be proceeding with that way.
We also did customer research groups separate from this project, but for a larger project. And part of it was some of the technology components in which the ease of doing business. So we did have a marketing research group where we engaged with to do an external, more end customer versus agent, which are different.
And I think that can play into, I know we're running up on time, but if you have agencies that specialize in something, some agencies do pretty well in certain niches. We have a few of our own that we kind of really partner with at on a bigger scale within certain niches of our own. They obviously have specialization. They can give you much more direct feedback and, a competitive landscape on, all right, who are my competitors in that very small space and what do they do that we don't? The relationships are going to, enable those conversations. And I think for the most part, independent agents really do value the mutual carrier relationship and, the values that we bring as a group to the industry, the consistency, the fairness, the brotherhood. I think there's something to be said for that, where, we're seeing, the nationals getting away from direct underwriter relationships with their agencies. And it's kind of, round robin type underwriting relationships. The relationships are where it's at. That's our bread and butter, and we have to thrive on those.
Geek. Yep. Yep. Great question. So the question was, as mutual companies are embarking on a lot of different technology journeys right now, between converting from existing platforms to new platforms and or creating enhancements in existing platforms, when's the right time to start to do this work? I'd say on that slide that we had for when do you start, like how and where to begin, none of this is technology really dependent. Maybe getting a quote data set is, but I would say this is foundational to identifying how important this work is, Augie. So I would say we're embarking with a client on a brand new product and they want to do it. I've had a client say, I want to make absolutely like very minimal changes. We're doing a product restructure in like 2 years, but we want to get a little bit better now. So when we rebuild later, we really have insight into that. So it's really about how you think about that. TW just went through, finished their conversion, and now they're like, okay, it's been a year. Now let's refine it. And so as you think about the scope, I think you can really do it. However, it's dependent upon the technology resource you have. But I think at any point you could be able to start working on it. And it starts honestly with the business work. Ron, did you have another question? Okay.
actually gets cost and the quality. So I think like name, address, database that populates
Yep.
all the other.
Mm-hmm. So the question is, going into the future, do we see a point in time where really name, address, and minimal information would provide like a full standard quote? I think some of the, the Root, the Lemonade, those folks are doing it from an auto perspective. I think as you see more homogeneous type risks, there will be more and more insurtechs out there with the ability to have really great quality data. I don't ever see it going away. And I think commercial lines is going to be always a little bit more difficult given the industry backgrounds are so different and the question sets are so different. But, my prior role, I was in the personal line space for 8 years, and then I was in small commercial for 8 years at Travelers. My last role was really building the comparative rater strategy for small commercial. And so you think about comparative raters in personal lines, it's 80% of the market today. That's how it's all quoted. Going into commercial lines, it's going to be coming. I mean, I don't think it's very soon. You're probably still 10, 15 years out from having much more streamlined quoting, I'd say, in the commercial line space. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, it's coming. I think the pretty vanilla Main Street classes, the BOP eligible type stuff, like it'll be here. A lot of carriers already have it. We're seeing more and more of those insurtechs pop up. We're seeing some collaboration across some larger national carriers as well, building kind of that small commercial comparative rater. And I think that's part of our strategy as a carrier, where our focus isn't on Main Street business, it's specialty. We see that being much more complex, more difficult to be kind of that zero underwriting goal. If anyone's heard of like kind of the race to zero, agents talk about that a lot. Basically they want zero underwriting. That ain't happening in TW's world. At least not anytime soon, I can tell you that. Because we do write specialty business. But yeah, for the homogenous type risk,
Yeah.
it's here and it will be coming faster. The BOP type, commercial auto, like you said, personal auto is kind of there already.
Yeah.
Pulls all that, DOT data, can pre-fill all the vehicles for you. Like you guys know, it's all there.
Yeah.
But
I think the more niche markets you have, the more I think underwriting you'll always have, just because it's a little bit different. And that's what a lot of what the mutual space is. It's serving the communities you're in. So, well, I think we're out of time. So thanks everyone. And if you had any other questions, I'll be here. And John, I think you're headed out, but
I am, but feel free to call or email.
yeah, call or email. Thanks,
Jess,
guys.
John, thank you very much. It's interesting. Good. Thank you. All right, so we're supposed to take a little bit of a break, I believe. So why don't we, even though I almost promised to try to get you out earlier, we had a lot of questions there, so unfortunately not. So let's get back here at 2:15, and then we'll start the next session. Thank you very much.
Hello, can you hear me? Jen and Juan, if you can hear me, go ahead and turn on your video and go ahead and unmute yourself. We're going to do a quick audio test. Safe travels. Jen and Juan, if you can hear me, go ahead and turn on your video and your audio. We're going to do a quick audio test.
Oh, yeah.
Now, and I've got my video on, but I don't see me. Are you there?
Yes,
No.
we are.
Oh, hi.
Yep, and we can hear you as well. We just cannot see you.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, I'll talk to you later. Okay, bye. Okay, I'm working on my video.
Sounds great.
Oh, there we go.
Yep, now we can see you, Jen.
Great.
Juan was talking for a second.
She probably restarted. There she is. Hello.
Hi.
Okay, I have Chris here as well. You are live, just so everyone online can also hear us, but I wanted to introduce you both, or all three of you.
Great.
Hi, ladies. How are you?
Hi, Chris. How are you?
Doing fine. Were any additions or changes to the questions? I think that I can hit certain number of topics, and there are a certain number of topics that I have no idea about, and I'm going to leave it up to you.
Okay.
We can quickly talk about it. Just that list of questions. Number one, Jennifer and I just talked. Jennifer can lead, and then any of the other we can add on to any of these questions. But thinking Jennifer can lead the first one. Thinking Chris, if you want to take on number two on the mandatory vaccination requirements. Are you comfortable with that?
Yeah, I can definitely handle the lead on question two, so that's not a problem. And I expected that I would probably have to, discuss number three as well as number five. So.
Yeah.
Okay, and I can jump in a little on number 4 on the ETS requirements. I mean, the way I see it, it is specifically with face coverings, the ETS is not preempting generally applicable requirements that the state requires. However, the vaccine mandate has been intended to preempt state law, as far as I've studied. But Chris,
There
if
is
you
some
want to jump in there too, go ahead.
Yeah, there are some recent developments about it's kind of the Fifth Circuit Court.
Yes.
So that would tie in, and if you're comfortable, yeah.
Well,
Want to take a look?
I'll let you do you want to talk about the Fifth Circuit developments?
Yeah.
I mean, or Chris, are you updated on that? I can.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak a little bit, but Chris, are you more familiar with
Okay.
speaking on that?
I'm sorry, it's a little hard to hear you on my end. The
Sorry
room
about
is
that, Chris.
loud, and we're getting your audio through the speakers, so I can't really hear what you guys were talking about.
Oh, the ETS, the OSHA's recent ETS developments, the Fifth Circuit.
Circuit's decision.
Actually, I have not been keeping up with that, so that I'll leave that to you.
Okay,
Yeah, okay. I can take that on,
okay.
you guys, and it just and then that the message is just you should still try to comply, even
Yes,
if it's
yes.
in hiatus at the moment. Okay, and then Chris, you're going to do 5.
Yep.
And what is covered by EPL, that is something that I will start off on, and Jennifer will jump in as needed, and Chris can too. And then I'll tackle on how carriers are evaluating losses too as part of that, because I remember that was a question that you guys had brought up.
Yep.
And then 7 other coverages impacted. Jennifer will lead that. And 8, I was going to rely on Chris to provide those real life examples, and Jennifer and I can chime in with other potentials.
Absolutely.
And I think the last question, what can employers expect? I can start it off, but I think that'd be great if all of us chime in on what it is.
Sure. Okay.
Great.
So there, we'll have you up at the podium up there. We've got the mic already set up. Yep.
Okay, I'm going to go on mute.
Them on the screen.
Thank you both so much for joining us virtually, and thank you audience members for being patient with us as we do this quick test. Juan and Jen, I just wanted to remind you as well, I will take on the Q&A for you. So if we do have some that roll through, I will make sure to announce them to you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you all. We should begin here in a couple minutes.
Thank you. All right, we're going to get started again. The next session is actually a panel session dealing with, of all things, COVID, pandemic related kind of economic impacts, and on employee liability as well. Very timely. We thought by now this pandemic may be long past us, but as you know, it's not. It's still affecting us, and it's affecting us not just medically, but also on the public policy perspectives as well. We know there's lots of lawsuits going on related to the latest OSHA guidance that came out on vaccine mandates and all those other kinds of things. So it's still a very fluid situation, and hopefully the rest of our panel will show up at some point, but we have, oh, there they are. Hello. Nice to see you. They are here. So what we have here is, Molly, I'll ask you to raise your hand so they know who you are. Molly, say hello. Oh, next one, sorry. Owen? Oanh?
Nguyen.
Thank you. Nguyen, please say hello.
Hello, everybody. Wish I was there in person to be at the seminar here.
Well, thank you very much. Jen, you must be the next person.
Yes, hi, everyone. Thank you so much. for allowing me to attend virtually.
And we have Chris here with us from Thomas Thompson Hafer, a local attorney firm and a PAMIC member as well. So I guess what I'll do is, instead of reading bios, if you want to introduce yourself when you speak again, you could do that. Otherwise, I want to turn it over to you and get started. So thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. Happy to be here in person, and my colleagues are on Zoom, so this is going to be a unique situation. We're kind of going to try to do a little bit of a fireside chat, so we want to get some questions from the audience going, but we also developed kind of a list of questions to go through to kind of feed the discussion, and we're all going to have our own little beats and bits that we all have specialties in. My practice is a little bit unique, at least my colleagues tell me that it's unique, in the fact that I do both workers' compensation and employer practices liability. I've also dabbled in general liability as well. And I have a unique perspective when it comes to employee relations, as well as the claimant defendant game in workers' compensation, as I've practiced on both sides of the aisle for about equal times in my career. Currently, I'm an attorney with Thomas Thompson Hafer in Harrisburg, and doing about 50% of my practice, as I said, as employer practices liability. The COVID, and I really get tired of saying this, the COVID situation has brought a unique turn to all of our practices in the employer practices liability world. I am more than happy to share later on in our discussion some unique facts situations that I've dealt with discrimination claims that have arisen out of the pandemic. But I don't know if the two ladies on the virtual world want to introduce themselves, and then we can kind of go right into our discussion. Jen, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure, thank you. My name is Jennifer Hamilton. I'm the president and CEO of NAMIC Insurance Company. We provide ICPL, insurance company professional liability, as well as D&O and agents E&O claims for many of you. And if some of you out there have our policies, we want to thank you for your business. We do offer employment practices liability coverage added onto our ICPL and D&O policies. Prior to going in-house with Chubb and then now with NAMICO, I worked as a coverage attorney in New York, handling primarily directors and officers in EPL coverage.
All right, thanks, Jennifer. I am Nguyen, and I am product manager at HSB, product manager for specialty liability lines, which includes EPL as the primary product, and also responsibility with over professional liability and cyber as well.
Okay, maybe we want to start this discussion with our first question that we've created, and maybe that generates some questions from the audience. I guess we'll pose it out to the group. What COVID exposures are employers faced with related to employment policies and procedures? Well, obviously, the first one goes without saying that we're dealing with COVID exposures, literally COVID exposures in the workplace. We're dealing with people, your workers, you're dealing with your employees actually getting COVID and spreading it to the other employees. And that's where COVID mitigation procedures are important. Secondarily to that, you're dealing with discrimination aspects where people claim that they need special types of accommodations for underlying conditions related to COVID, whether it's inside a workplace that deals with blue collar situation, manufacturing, or whether they're dealing in the service industry. And we're talking about interaction, customer facing interaction. We're first and foremost facing those types of things, in addition to, if we are customer facing, worried about our customers as well as our vendors. Anything else?
Yes, absolutely. So in terms of acting as an employer, you know, as we're all aware, the Biden administration has new guidance and then vaccine requirements that have been implemented. And although those are, I believe, being challenged by, I think it's 26 state attorney generals at this attorneys general at this time, you know, it's our recommendation to follow the guidelines, and that it's best practice of employers to follow the guidelines. But some of the exposures employers could face, obviously, are protection of employees and when as employees return to the workplace, but not only discrimination, but retaliation as well. Some employees, and we've seen this, have for either religious or disability exemptions, or sometimes even for philosophical reasons, have chosen not to get a vaccine. And, you know, the question is then, what do employers do in that situation? And what are some of the exposures employers could face? Most, Juan will get into this a little bit later, but most EPL policies don't cover OSHA mandates. However, something employers need to pay attention to is retaliation. That is an exposure that employers may face if they have to terminate an employee because they are requiring all employees come back to the office and someone doesn't want to follow an employer mandate. So that is something that needs to be considered. In addition, our privacy rights claims, and we can look at that a little bit later too. You know, what can employers do and what can't they do in terms of testing and providing protection for their employees with regard to this pandemic. So there are various exposures for employers present right now. Juan, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add there.
You captured it very well, Jennifer. I would add just discrimination at any time that an employer takes action, whether it be layoffs in this economic environment or making decisions to return to work. The discrimination claims can arise if there's disparate treatment stemming from those policies or procedures. And retaliation and wrongful termination, the whistleblower activities that employees make or employees reporting unsafe work conditions can lead to an EPL claim for retaliation and wrongful termination. If there is if an employee has a COVID diagnosis and is terminated, unfortunately, that could be grounds for a wrongful termination claim.
Yeah, that's a good point. The wrongful termination aspect of it. I mean, in Pennsylvania, we don't see that many wrongful termination claims that are legitimately wrongful termination, because that's a term of art in the legal world when we're talking about a person who's terminated after asserting a legal right. They file a workers' compensation claim and you get fired because of that. That's a wrongful termination claim that gets litigated in the Court of Common Pleas, not in the workers' compensation world. Similarly, if you file an unemployment compensation claim while you're still working because you're underemployed, again, you get terminated, that's a wrongful termination claim. But that's interesting that you brought that up. One could be because we're talking about if somebody gets diagnosed with COVID and then they get fired as a result of getting COVID, that very well might bring about a wrongful termination claim. Where that goes and how long that wrongful termination claim lasts in the Court of Common Pleas, I think would be an interesting legal case to bring up. So that's an interesting point that you brought up there. Well, you touched on it a little bit, both of you did, talking about mandatory vaccination requirements. Let's expand that discussion to vaccination requirements under the Biden rules, as well as employer policies as well. And also, what about testing requirements? Let's expand and talk about that. Do you want to start us off, Juan? I mean, happy to listen to you first, and I can chime in, or if you'd like me to start.
Yeah, I mean, so OSHA had some recent requirements pertaining to vaccinations, testing, and face coverings. And, all covered employers must enact a written vaccination policy that either requires all of their employees to be vaccinated And there's nothing, no requirement for boosters, but the other part of it is that it permits unvaccinated employees to continue working if they undergo regular testing and wear face coverings indoors. The U.S. Court of Appeals, Fifth Circuit permanently blocked the OSHA from enforcing this mandate. This is just brand new, just developed as of Saturday. So we're kind of all absorbing it. But despite the uncertainty, I guess, it's still prudent for employers to comply with the ETS as much as possible.
I would add to that also just in terms of specifics. It's my understanding that employers who fall under who have businesses with 100 or more employees have until January 4th. Their employees need to be vaccinated, and it's my understanding it's 2 doses of the Pfizer or Moderna, or the 1 dose of the Johnson & Johnson, and then if they're unvaccinated or if they haven't been, that's considered fully vaccinated. If they're not fully vaccinated, they have to wear masks beginning December 5th. And that's the OSHA requirement. Again, the Fifth Circuit has thrown a bit of a wrench into that. We were, as they mentioned earlier, that these laws are being challenged, but it is probably best practices to stay as close to OSHA guidelines as possible.
100% agree. Obviously, we don't know where the courts are going to take this. It's going to be very interesting to follow exactly where this goes. However, I guess the real question is that why is the EEOC allowing this to happen? Even before the Biden administration took over, the EEOC issued guidance that basically listed the pandemic, COVID-19, as a direct threat. Therefore, almost all of the ADA requirements, absent talking about religious or disability accommodations, go out the window. You can treat every person that walks into your business as an employee as a direct threat. Therefore, that opens them up to the ability to test them on a daily or more frequent regular intervals for COVID-19. What you cannot do is have their blood tested for COVID antibodies. That's a more invasive test, and that's not allowed. It's currently not allowed by the EEOC. Additionally, they are, even before the Biden mandate went out, they were allowing the employees to be required to take the vaccine or in an alternative setting, be wearing a mask and getting tested regularly. Or other alternatives, namely, in my, just for example, my office has a policy in place that I think is a good policy for right now, that if you choose not to get vaccinated, you have to wear a mask while outside of a closed office door. And if you misrepresent your status and we find out about it, that can subject you to immediate termination. Some of these policies have a little bit more teeth than others do. I'm getting a lot of calls about employers wanting policies to be put in place to meet their COVID requirements so that they aren't subject to additional liability, whether it's health and safety or EPLI generally. And that was before the Biden mandate went into place. So it's really a developing field, and it's keeping us very busy. The general, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just going to ask, maybe you could expand a little bit on what that means, that the EEOC has spoken to something and how that could be helpful in the defense. Having the EEOC issue the indicate that employees are direct threats. And it's sort of what that would mean in terms of a defense if you were sued by an employee, to have sort of the EEOC's backing, how that could be helpful in a defense.
Jen, it's helpful, and it's not all that helpful at the same time.
Okay.
EEOC, they are an important framework for what we have in our employment and discrimination federal cases right now. I mean, everyone knows that if you're handling an EPLI claim, discrimination, harassment, et cetera, everything has to go to the EEOC or the local state agency first before anyone gets their right to sue letter in state or federal court. It has to be, so therefore the EEOC is always a step that's involved in any discrimination lawsuit. The EEOC weighed in and gave their recommendations and their advice as to this pandemic early on in the pandemic. It was on their website. It was on various letter blasts for their recommendations going out as early as April of 2020 regarding how to treat employees in the workplace. It is somewhat of a rubber stamp to say that the EEOC has weighed in and given their guidance on this, and it is a bit of a helpful defense, but simply because the EEOC has weighed in on something doesn't give you an absolute defense when you go to court. When you go in front of a federal judge, they're going to want to know that you actually went through the important discussions for employees under the either Americans with Disabilities Act or other various statutes, rather than just said, I followed the EEOC guidance. Again, that's helpful, but it's not going to carry the day. The ADA says that if a person has a disability, you must engage in an interactive process to meet an accommodation that is appropriate unless there's an undue hardship to the employer. The direct threat analysis takes you outside of that framework that only captures a certain portion of those exceptions, religious and just other disabilities that might prevent that person from being able to get vaccinated. So if a person is a direct threat, and I think that a court would find and uphold that type of analysis if it were to come up, that the pandemic is a direct threat. But simply just saying that the EEOC did it, I don't necessarily know carries the day, but it is a good jumping off point, Jen.
Great. Thanks.
Well, since we're here, the exemption's based upon religious beliefs and disabilities. Anyone want to jump in on that?
Well,
You know, I could
go ahead.
go ahead.
No,
I
no.
was going to jump in here and say that along those lines that Chris alluded to, the exceptions that are allowed are you can employees can request it based on their religious beliefs or their disabilities. Employees who cannot get that vaccine because of their disability or religious beliefs may still be entitled to reasonable accommodations under the ADA. They should still tread carefully in denying any accommodations if it's not an undue hardship. The EEOC guidance was more employer friendly, I would say, in allowing an employer to further question or further ask for supporting documentation or to really strengthen that employee's religious belief defense or request for an exemption. So that I think was very, very good guidance and helpful for employers.
What is important about the religious beliefs and the fact that the statute specifically says that it's a strongly held religious belief? Has anyone dealt with that, with challenging a strongly held religious belief, or should the employer just kind of take it on face value that the person has a religious belief, or does it have to be a strongly held religious belief?
I haven't dealt with that specifically. I know the EEOC has sort of issued some guidance, and we keep going back to the EEOC though, that, you know, if an employee states that their religious belief is sincere, that should be accepted at face value. However, that said, an employer can ask questions on how that religious belief affects their ability to get the vaccine. And again, as Juan had mentioned, it would be prudent to take measures, you know, reasonable measures that you could take for that employee, if you could allow that employee to work from home if that's possible, but any accommodations to keep you out of the purview of an ADA claim could be helpful.
I 100% agree with you. Again, Jen, I appreciate that. I like asking questions to which I know the answer and then rattle off exactly what I was going to say. At this point, unless there is evidence to the contrary, I think that employers need to take what the employees say regarding strongly held religious beliefs at face value. I think as the ADA shifted away from somebody proving a disability back in 2008 under the Obama administration and went to accommodations. The same thing is true here. I think they're shifting away from, well, I don't think you really truly have those strongly held religious beliefs to, you probably do. What can we do to accommodate those things? So that being said, I'm of the mindset that most of the discussion with the employee should be tailored towards accommodation. And if there cannot be an accommodation, make sure you document everything that goes on in those meetings with the employee that says, I'm not going to get a shot. You can't make me get a shot. And here's what I understand my rights are. Make sure you document everything about what you are trying to do and what you have done for this employee to keep them gainfully employed to avoid that ADA lawsuit that you do not want. I'm currently litigating 5 ADA lawsuits right now, and they're not cheap. They are not cheap. Before you even get to discovery on the federal claim, you've spent money on the administrative, either EEOC or the PHRC. Before you get to discovery, you've done your motions to dismiss. By the time you get to trial, you're out a lot of money. At least the insurance companies are. Anything else?
Well, I'd just say, Chris, to that point as well, just of note, it's been my experience, it costs the plaintiff and the claimant nothing to file an EEOC charge. So they don't have to be represented to file an EEOC charge. So that's why it is, you just want to pay attention to what your employee is saying to you. And if it is possible to have an accommodation that may be in your company's best interest.
Mhm.
Jen, this is taking my history buff aspect of it, because I always like to tell the story of the history of at least of the PHRC. The PHRC in Pennsylvania was created to eliminate the bog of cases that were clogging up the Court of Common Pleas. And the PHRC was developed around the same time the Commonwealth Court was developed to eliminate that bog of cases that are going through the Court of Common Pleas that shouldn't have been there, state agency cases, et cetera, et cetera. But the PHRC, the goal was to weed through the cases that had no merit. Unfortunately, that ended up being that every case ended whether or not there was a finding with a person's right to sue letter. So generally speaking, the EEOC rarely makes a finding of discrimination or of undue harassment or anything like that. And everyone still gets the right to sue. They sue in federal court, they sue in state court. So the courts are just as clogged up as they were. And we're also saddled with a 12 to 18 month administrative process on top of that to get there. So it's just more money out the door. And as Jen said, there's no money that goes out the pocket of the claimant or the complainant and their attorney. They don't even need an attorney. They can just walk into the EEOC or call them up and somebody walks them through the process of filing a complaint. They sign it, it gets sent out. Then you're out there spending money defending it.
That's exactly right. Yes. And it's been, and it was a while since I've done EPL defense, but it could be even meritless claims, not involving complex issues like the pandemic we're dealing with right now and religious exemptions, but obviously patently meritless claims could cost anywhere from $15,000 to $25,000 just to get rid of. And again, those are much less complicated claims, and that was 12 years ago. So so I'm sure with inflation and then rates going up, it can cost more than that.
Mhm.
So the next question on our agenda is, how does OSHA's recent ETS requirements pertaining to vaccination testing and face coverings affect employers? I'll let you start off, Juan. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think we covered that earlier. I mean, despite right now, there's some uncertainty and there seems to be pushback. The right approach, the prudent thing for employers to do is to still be prepared to comply. I think it's just best practices, and we just have to monitor what the guidance of maybe the deadlines are going to be. It sounds like maybe OSHA might have to come back and make some revisions, but just regardless, it's best practices to move forward and do it your best as a company to comply with the ETS.
And I would just add to that, you know, even though everything's in flux right now, the original intent of the ETS, or the emergency temporary standard, which are these vaccination mandates, the original intent was to preempt state law on this, but that did not preempt local applicable mask laws. And you know, so if you live in a county that requires masks everywhere indoors, that requirement would stay in place in addition to the OSHA requirements. But the ETS did intend to preempt all state requirements regarding employers with 100 or more employees.
Maybe you two can speak to this to expand the discussion on this point a little bit more, because you probably have more direct contact with this for OSHA purposes. What if an employer decides, if the OSHA ETS is upheld, what if an employer says, I'm going to thumb my nose? What consequences do they have to deal with from OSHA perspective?
Be prepared to pay lots of fines and penalties. That, yeah, if you don't want to, if you want to thumb your nose, be prepared to pay for that. I think that's it's short and sweet, but that's really what it comes down to me.
Well, and in addition, and I think those fines were around 13,000 and per occurrence, but in addition to that, from a litigation standpoint, if you thumb your nose, so you can get fined by OSHA, but then you've also got this directive that you're not following, that if that gets put before a court and put before a jury, you could get outcomes and verdicts maybe not in your favor if you're not following these guidelines, if it were to head into litigation. And that would be on the flip side. We're talking about employees that don't want to get vaccinated before, but this is on the flip side about employees coming to work saying you're not providing a safe work environment, and filing a lawsuit in that end. So I agree with Juan that it would be prudent to follow the guidelines if you can.
Here's another question. In the event that the employer doesn't follow the mandates or follow the appropriate guidance of the CDC, other than workers' compensation, are there any other potential avenues for an employee to sue an employer for having them catch COVID in the workplace if they can prove it?
Absolutely. I mean, there's health and safety issues with regard to that if they can prove it, and negligence on behalf of the employer for providing a safe workplace. But there are also, and we were going to get into this a little bit later, but director and officer considerations. I know in smaller private companies as opposed to larger public companies, directors and officers are often involved in management decisions and oversight of management decisions in terms of protections in the workplace. So there are claims that could be possible in that regard as well.
Okay. Well, it sounds like it could be a difficult slog if you don't follow the appropriate regulations or the guidance. How should employers respond when employees request accommodations to work remotely? I think, as we alluded to before, we're talking about the direct threat analysis of the ADA request for accommodation. I think the majority of workspaces could be modified to allow the person to work in a safe environment, using masks, using the vaccination requirements if the size of your employer meets that requirement. So I guess the real question is allowing a person to work remotely, if their job allows for it, an undue hardship to the employer. I'm struggling to find a situation outside of a assembly line or a factory worker where a person that has a desk job couldn't necessarily do that work remotely with appropriate access. What do you think?
Oh, go ahead, Juan.
I was going to say it's an interactive dialogue with that employee, and really, and if you decide not to, for whatever reason, accommodate that rule should be applicable, consistent for all employees. So you can't pick and choose which employees, if they're doing the same type of work, why you would grant the ability to work remote to one employee and not the other. If you do, make sure it's documented very well.
Yeah, and to piggyback on that a little bit, I mean, you definitely want some type of protocol in place, a written plan in place that you can apply to all employees. So whether it specifically aligns with the OSHA guidelines or not, or if it's sort of a hybrid that your company decides to implement, I would work with HR and make sure that that's something that's not only in writing, but also communicated to all employees. So it gives the appearance of propriety and being fair, and then each accommodation take on a case-by-case basis. And again, as Juan said, document everything. That would be my recommendation.
I apologize for that. I didn't realize that my phone was on. It's still not on. I will take that one step further, though. The policies are important, but as a person who delves in workers' compensation and also the EPLI aspect, I will say that job descriptions are also very important. If you're going to have a policy that allows people to work remotely and you're going to effectively do it in a transparent way with no favoritism, you got to make sure you're having you're revising your job descriptions on a regular basis to allow for those people to work remotely if that's something that you intend to have done. I don't think that there can be an effective policy without effective job descriptions. And it may be just as simple as a couple tweaks of a few words. But I deal with this all the time in workers' compensation. We have a very fine job policy, and then we have a horrible job description that doesn't really talk about what the job does or the requirements of the job. It's just very generic, very basic, and it undermines portions of the case. Here is another one of those situations where if you want to do this dispassionately, you got to go back, work through your job descriptions, and make sure that if in fact this is something where you cannot work remotely, that it's got to be within the job description. Make it a mandate in the job description that this is something that needs to be done on premises. Yes, we have a question.
Thank you. So as all these organizations that we work for are trying to establish what return to work looks like, this question I think is very, very pertinent. So if you think about remote work versus back in the normal office work, I understand job function, and then I understand job description. But can you take into account performance in terms of one employee may perform better in an office environment with supervisors around versus one that is an independent worker? That seems like you take into account performance, all other aspects of the employee-employment relationship. Can you also do it in terms of remote work?
It's a good question. You want to jump in on that, or would you like me to take it?
I think you can take it, Chris.
Thank you. Yeah, I think
it's a great question.
I think it is a very good question, and it really goes to that dynamic of. I think that's one of the better questions that I've been asked in an EPLI seminar, because it undertakes that discussion of the dynamic between the employer and the employee, and really taking into account those performance types of questions. I don't have a problem with that. Having the correct job description and job functions in place allows you to take that next step in documenting the person's deficiencies. But you got to start with those job descriptions. If the job description itself falls flat on its face, then you can't jump to those discussions of performance and evaluations regarding whether they work better on-site or offsite. They start with the job descriptions, job evaluations, then you can go into their performance. I have no problem with that, but just make sure you document it and make sure that their past performance reviews reflect that they work better with supervisory people right there before you make that next step. And if these are, perfunctory evaluations that person's doing great and doing wonderful, then when you deny the person that right to work from home, and everything that's been documented so far has not been referencing any problems, that's where you're going to run into a real discriminatory issue. As long as you're documenting everything, performance can be on the table.
And I would even,
Oh, I'm sorry, Jen, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, I would consider even maybe being a little more specific in your performance evaluations now that we do have this remote environment. Maybe consider a question in there, how the employee is performing in a remote environment. I mean, that could possibly be a discussion. I don't know how that would be phrased, but in thinking about that in terms of additional documentation.
Yeah, I think keeping up with keeping up with their tasks, their job duties being remote versus in person, if you can actually do that analysis, I think that would be important. We have another question over here.
Yeah, so in this fluid work environment, as companies try to figure it out, and I hear your comments about adding clear job descriptions, but does that expose a company when there are exceptions to the rule? So like to the previous question, where an individual manager or department decides to make an exception for one person, but the general job description is locked in saying that has to be in person. Does that expose the company when there's inconsistency? And that's something we're seeing tremendously right now is there's no one size fits all right now.
Right.
It's really specified to departments, to individuals, to their jobs.
Well, I guess the question back to you is, what are the reasons that the exceptions are being made? If the rule is in place, why are we making exceptions for people under certain circumstances? If it's a medical reason, then there's your reason why. If it's simply I like Jane better than Beth, then obviously that potentially brings about exposure in some way, shape, or form, because somebody's got to have a disability there and somebody's got to say, they're treating this person better than the other person. Is there a particular reason that there's?
Well, in general, it's usually you want to keep that person, right? Like if they're, especially right now with a tough job market, people can have many options. And so when you want to retain your good employees, you kind of get a little more flexible, right? So even if the rule says one thing, the individual cases usually look very different for high performers.
That is a tough question that needs to be addressed by the employer. I don't think I have a direct answer for you on that one, only to say that I think the risk to the company is using those exceptions versus changing the rule altogether. If you change the rule altogether and then give the people the right to do what they want under the job description, changing it to work in person versus work remotely, and then you're not singling out those exceptions to make people stay, maybe make a change overall. But that's got to be analysis by the company as to, what are we willing to do to keep the talent? And what are the risks associated with this, type of exposure?
And that's a good point too, because we're facing that also as a company. As we're hiring, we're looking at hiring people who live elsewhere and that would work remotely full time. And that's something we build into their offer letter or their employment agreement that may not have been built into another employment agreement, given the way how difficult it is to find employees today. However, I would suspect that if you had an employee that was taking advantage of a situation like that to work from home, there could also be performance issues that could be documented. And I would just, piggybacking on what Chris said, I would focus on those issues more so maybe than them demanding they work from home. Focus on their performance issues and pay attention to the performance issues.
I think we have a question from the internet.
Yes, we do have a virtual question. The question is, have any COVID-19 related discrimination or wrongful termination claims made their way through the courts yet, both from an EPL and a bigger picture E&O standpoint?
I can speak to that on EPL. Yes, we have identified some, the EPL policy in itself covers wrongful employment practices, wrongful employment acts arising, or some examples: discrimination, retaliation, wrongful termination. Now, if the employee is alleging that the wrongful termination is related to COVID, then we consider that as a COVID resultant claim, not a direct COVID claim. But yeah, so we have seen it. There was definitely more, I'd say, in 2020 because of the closures that were going on. There has not been as many in 2021 yet. But yes, we have seen claims and they have amounted to some claim dollars being paid.
I think that the person rephrased their question and they wanted to know about, instead of E&O, they wanted to know D&O coverage. Is there anything that you might want to speak to about the D&O coverage coming from a COVID claim? Is that change your analysis at all, or is that the same?
I can't speak to D&O specific losses, but I imagine that there has been D&O claims that have been made. I think, Jen, you had alluded to the claims being made about not having a safe workplace. So that's a management issue that EPL does not cover, but I'm sure that there has been claims made. I don't know about payouts or the success on those claims.
Well, we haven't seen those claims come in, but we have had our policyholders and our members reach out to us and ask us questions about implementing COVID protocols and what those claims could look like, and whether or not, asking specifically whether or not there would be coverage for that. From a D&O standpoint, I mean, we offer an EPL add-on to our D&O policies, but even if you didn't have that EPL add-on, there can be director and officer claims. It just depends on your company size and how involved the directors and officers get in management decisions. And in many of the smaller companies, many private companies and non-for-profit companies, a lot of directors and officers are involved in these management decisions, or are even, we've seen claims, not necessarily COVID related yet, and knock on wood, hopefully we won't, but we have seen many claims where directors and officers have been advised of something and they've been brought into a lawsuit specifically named, and our D&O policies have been implicated. So I think that would depend on, again, the size of the company and the role of the directors and officers in the management.
Okay. I mean, I think we covered portions of this, but maybe we can speak more generally to what is covered by EPL coverage. I'd like to get, this is not my field of expertise. I don't deal with coverage issues. I usually get, wound up and sent off in a direction, and the coverage issues are left to other people. So I'll let you two battle it out on this.
Yeah, so I will start off, and Jen, you jump in here. But the EPL coverage, it's defense cost and settlement costs that are covered for claims of those wrongful employment acts like discrimination and wrongful termination. It's fairly broad. The key, though, I really want to stress this, is the value is the defense costs. So Chris, getting Chris engaged in a charge is, even without merit, even if there's no merit, that administrative process, the time that it takes to resolve it, that's money that has to be paid to defend it. So it is very valuable. That I think that's the key, really a very key component of the coverage. No company is 100% safe. I know I hear a lot of insureds that might say that they're not interested because they know that their company, their employees love them. It's a great work culture. Can't get it's still you're not completely, you can never say with 100% certainty that none of your employees will bring a lawsuit. You can't say with 100% certainty that there will never be an employee termination, or unfortunately in an economic environment like we're operating in, that there might be some layoff activity. So anytime there's disgruntled employees, there still could be that charge made. So that is the main coverage, the component. Would be worthwhile to mention that EPL coverage, EPL policies also do extend to non-employee claimants. So discrimination or harassment claims made by customers or vendors are sometimes covered. This is especially a meaningful coverage for industries, classes that have a high volume or high level of customer interaction in the hospitality industry, restaurants, hotels. And then finally, I do want to mention the risk management services that are often offered on EPL. So aside from the coverage itself, there's legal advice hotlines. So not an actual claim yet, but to speak to an attorney well-versed in employment practices and risk management for policy, risk management websites to give access for employee handbooks, sample employee handbooks, sample employment applications, policies and procedures is a nice add-in to supplement the entire EPL program.
I mean, I would agree with everything that you said. I would just, highlight EPL covers some general areas, employment status, so any type of wrongful termination, any discrimination, harassment, retaliation, privacy rights claims that could be important during COVID, and it may cover negligence claims in providing a safe workplace. Most EPL does not cover, they don't cover bodily injury claims, but they could cover claims of negligence and overall not providing a safe workplace. And to Juan's point, I know we as a company advise all of our policyholders, if you have a question, if you think this could be a claim, if you think this is something, just pick up the phone, call us, call me, call any of our claims adjusters and ask. We work with a third-party vendor we can put you in touch with. We can also, have something called pre-claims assistance where we can get you in touch with an attorney to help guide you through that process, because this is complicated. And as Juan mentioned, everybody thinks their employees are great and they're so happy and love it there, until they don't. And then something happens, and this type of thing, unfortunately, can be contagious. No pun intended, but the lawsuits can be, and certainly EEOC charges can be. That's what I would add to that.
Yeah.
Well,
I would like to.
Oh, go ahead, Juan.
I would also like to add, because I know the three of us had talked about, how are carriers evaluating losses on EPL right now? And the answer to that is just, it's still cautiously. We're operating in unprecedented times. When we were thinking about emerging exposures, I assure you that global pandemic and office closures was not on that list. So This is a product that is very broad, and outside of COVID, there was already great need in the coverage and social impact or social justice movements, Me Too back in 2018, and the Black Lives Movement and related movements that started really coming to the forefront last year. These are all examples of how EPL coverage is impacted. So it is a very impactful coverage, and it's much easier to get the coverage in preparation for any potential claims going forward, as opposed to you as a company has made the decision to make some layoffs and terminate some employees. It's harder to get the coverage. There will be more underwriting scrutiny on those accounts.
Good point.
So I've been given the 5 minutes to go sign. And there are a couple more topics we want to cover. The next one is what other types of insurance coverages would be impacted. And I can just speak briefly to workers' compensation. Any COVID claims that have come in, direct COVID claims that have come in through the insurance carriers that I deal with, all of them have been denied, whether it's death claims, whether it's just simply a contracted COVID case, all of them have been denied on the basis of the fact that prove that you got it in the workplace. It's everywhere. You might work in close proximity, but prove it. And many of them, they can't find doctors to provide an opinion that supports causal relationship to the workplace. Any other coverages that would be impacted by COVID?
I think we pretty much hit D&O. We've covered that. I'd say ICPL, insurance company professional liability. That's primarily coverage for the company itself in underwriting decisions that are made, in claims decisions and claims handling decisions that are made. We have seen, as you all have seen and noticed, the rise in business interruption claims. So we've seen a lot of those come in. Fortunately, for the insurance industry, they've been decided in favor of the insurers. But in terms of employment, I don't think ICPL would respond directly to that. So I think we would, you definitely want a strong EPL coverage in place.
I have the next thing on the list as Chris to provide real life case examples with favorable rulings from PHRC. I'm happy to talk about that. I had a case that went through the PHRC. I'll talk about it briefly. I only have 3 minutes. It was a small restaurant in Altoona, Pennsylvania. And the woman, it started in the beginning of COVID. I think the claim was brought in May or June, right about the time that things were opening back up, May of June of 2020. The employer was going to be working in a setting of no customers in the restaurant, only order takeout. She was originally a waitress server. She said she couldn't do it because she has underlying high cholesterol, high blood pressure, and diabetes. She came to the employer with the requisite information. The employer said, okay, we can set you up as being a dishwasher and I'll even pay you the same rate. And I'm going to let you work as a dishwasher in a room by yourself. You don't have to be around anyone. We're not having customers come in. You can be all by yourself. The trays will get shoved through the door and you can work by yourself. She said, no, I'm not going to do that, and brought a PHRC complaint alleging discrimination on the basis that she was not provided an accommodation. The PHRC went through this, looked at her job description before, looked at her job description after, saw the verifications from the employer that they would pay her the same rate. She would not be suffering any loss as a result. And the PHRC said the employer did accommodate appropriately and dismissed the case. So that's my positive outlook on what I've handled so far. I have 2 other ones that are currently going through litigation, and we're waiting to see what they're going on. And they're a little bit more nuanced in terms of the facts for whether an accommodation was appropriately made. That first one, the employer did everything right even before I got involved, so I can't take credit for the fact that he did the appropriate discussion of accommodations. Are there any other examples that you 2 know of?
No, we have not gotten a lot of employment practices cases so far. Now we have had, as I had mentioned, insureds reaching out to us for advice and to utilize that third-party hotline in terms of what they should do as these mandates start rolling out. But no, I don't have any live case examples to add.
Yeah, I named a couple earlier, but I think that was a really good case, Chris, that you just shared. And where an employer did everything that they were supposed to, but they still had to defend the case, and there is still cost associated with that. So that just highlights the value of the EPL coverage.
And I think we are out of time. So thank you very much. We appreciate that. Are there any questions on the floor? Seeing none, I thank you.
Thank you, folks, very much for your time. All right. Safe travels as well.
Thank you.
So I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay. We are going to actually skip the break, if you don't mind, so we can leave here a little bit earlier. I know you're going to get set up for the next presentation. And while you're doing that, I just want to share a couple of notes that I wrote down here. This discussion on EPLI, employee liability coverage and stuff is very important to all of us because we all are either employers or employees of a company. And PAMIC actually has what we call our HR and Law Center. It's a free, it's a benefit of membership to PAMIC that actually gives you great resources for employment type of situations. You can write your employee manuals, you can write job descriptions through it. It has all those kinds of things. But one of the things it also has is the ability to talk directly to an employment lawyer at no additional cost to you, and they can give you actionable advice. Now, they won't represent you or anything like that, but at least it would help you in your efforts to kind of fix, correct, deal with an employee type of issue, which could include COVID-related or anything else that's out there. So if you're not familiar with it, you can go to the website, check it out, take a look at what's going on, or give us a call, and we'll be more than happy to help you through that. So that's a great ending to this presentation. But also, as a you set up? Okay, well, I'll go very quickly then. One of the things that we're going to hear next is about cybersecurity. And I thought this was a good time just to mention that the Pennsylvania Insurance Department is working with the industry on the department's draft of the NAIC Model Cybersecurity Act. It's not in bill form yet, but it has been shared with some of our CIOs at our member companies for comment because this is not my area of expertise. But what it basically will be doing is setting up an entire regulatory scheme concerning your information security programs as well. So once it becomes in bill form, we'll shoot it out there for you, probably have some kind of educational programming on it as well. We'll probably see it sometime in 2022. Not exactly sure when in 2022, but given the fact that we're closely approaching the end of 2021, I don't see much activity going on there. But with that, we have Molly Corbett from Gen Re. As John Stone said, she's probably the smartest person at Gen Re, or something along those lines, he said. Oh, he said, I'm not going to use that, but I wouldn't disagree with him though, okay? But anyway, with that said, Molly's the Vice President, Chief Risk Officer for the North American Property and Casualty programs at Gen Re. She has a very thick resume here, but I'm not going to read it all. I'll let you do your own introduction. And once again, thank you for your time. We do just have the, I guess, last minute announcements. Make sure if you need your CE, you sign out appropriately when you leave, that kind of stuff. Our next in-person seminar is until March, but we do have some webinars that we're going to be putting on. I mentioned one earlier today on ESG, and I guess I promised we'll do one on what we call House Bill 1679 and 1680. So look for those things as well. With that, Molly, the floor is yours, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for hanging out with me. It's the last speaker of the day, as everyone says, it's the toughest spot. Here's our just standard legal, don't sue us. So a little background on my role at Genry, and then I'm going to talk about a number of things with cybersecurity. When I was thinking through a presentation on cyber trends, I realized that it can't just be about the insurance products. You have to cover the threats, and also there's a lot of government responses that are happening today. So we're going to go through that. So a little background on me, I am the Chief Risk Officer for North America PNC for Genry. And then I wear a secondary hat with responsibilities for our cyber treaty business in North America. On my Chief Risk Officer role in risk management, among my responsibilities is managing our aggregate exposures, which would include cyber insurance. And part of that role, I get involved and get to listen to our IT security team talk about all of the controls and measures that they do to protect the organization. So I think that helps complement me on the insurance and reinsurance product side for cyber as we try to have timely and appropriate coverages to respond to the exposures which are changing, and I'll talk about that. So I'll talk a little bit about cyber in the news, some threat trends, cybersecurity responses, a little bit about the insurance, and then, as I mentioned, the US government's response. And along the way, please feel free to ask questions. We can make this as interactive as you want it to be. So obviously cyber's in the news everywhere you see. When I went to Google articles, you can find a million. It's constant. These are some of the big highlights that I wanted to talk about, and some of the threats, whether it was nation states or criminal organizations, and the resulting event that occurred kind of run throughout the theme of the presentation. You'll see a lot of similar things happening. So the first, obviously, CNA, as I'm sure in my organization, I know it really scared people, and I'm sure it scared a lot of you and your organizations. One of the interesting things about the CNA hack is what information, so they ended up paying a $40 million ransom, which is obviously substantial and huge. But also what information was accessed and stolen. And one of the things that came out was that one of the pieces of information that the hackers got access to was the insurance policy. So the cyber insurance policies that CNA is selling. And why is that valuable? You then have a lot of intel on individual insureds and companies. You know what limits they're buying. So if you were going to go do a ransomware on, for example, some Fortune 500 company, and then you knew what their insurance limit was, you have a lot more information that you can use to negotiate against that company. Microsoft, which is obviously a common application platform that we all use, had an email hack on their email server. And that was eventually attributed to China. And what's interesting about that is, and I'll get into some of the motivations of these threat actors, but the information that they were seeking was a lot of competitive information on companies, as well as scientific technologies and medical science information that obviously is very valuable to our economy and to our private companies here in the US. I was kind of surprised to see this one. The Channel 9 news was a hack in Australia that interrupted live TV, which obviously you can see why that is concerning. In Florida, and this has a little bit, there was an attempt to poison Florida City's water supply by changing some of the chemical components that are used in the water treatment plant. And this one had an interesting element to it because with the pandemic, many of the employees were working from home. Thankfully, and those providing security were remote. Thankfully, there was one on-site employee, and earlier in the day, that person had noticed that their mouse had moved and was kind of taken aback by that. And then later in the day, watched as some of the number components in the chemicals changed right before their very eyes. And why that's obviously scary for many reasons, but also scary with the monitoring. Like, how are we monitoring in this new world as some employees are remote and some are in person? The Colonial Pipeline, and so both this water supply and the Colonial Pipeline can be concerning too, because in the United States, about 85% of our infrastructure, that critical infrastructure we all rely on, sits within the private sector. So we are relying on private companies and their security measures to protect the common interests of the US and our citizens. And in Colonial Pipeline, for example, the hackers used a stolen credential they'd access online, were able to log in legitimately. And in this case, there was around 5 a.m. that morning, there was a ransomware demand on a computer. By 6 a.m., the pipeline was completely shut down. It's one of the largest, I think it might be the largest pipeline in the US. And Colonial Pipeline didn't even know what had happened. So that person that saw the ransomware attack, that hadn't really, that information hadn't gone up the chain at Colonial Pipeline. And in fact, some of the employees at Colonial Pipeline were taking helicopters and flying down the pipeline to see if there was any holes or damage, what was leading to this shutdown of the pipeline. And they were informed by the government that, and eventually from their employees, that there had been this ransomware demand. Keep going with this cheery tale I'm telling you, but JBS is a meatpacking processing company. Kaseya is a company that has thousands of customers, and they provide managed service. They're managed service providers that I think they provide some cloud functions for other companies. And they were able to, the hackers in that case in Kaseya were able to use a vulnerability in the software to then hack into the customers. So with our interconnected world, it can start at the source or even just at an individual company. And obviously the government's taking, in the last article, this has just happened, they're starting to be louder with attributing attacks to individual companies, organizations, and individuals if they can. So as I mentioned, it's an interconnected world. Everybody has access on their cell phone to pay bills, shop, to do everything, right? And that's only going to continue to grow. Unfortunately, underpinning this complex and interwoven system that we all live in is sometimes, and as I know personally, individual companies, we have a complicated and oftentimes obsolete, sometimes unserviced or unable to update platforms. So if you think about an insurance company, for example, we do a lot of functions, right? So we have different information coming in to analyze and underwrite an individual piece of business. All of that information required for that is different depending on the business, line of business. Then you have to have functions to underwrite it. You have to have functions to process your policies. You have to have the ability to analyze and assess claims and make payments. And it's complex, and a lot of these systems that we all have at our companies are older. And so when systems are older or complicated, it's often really hard to update them, and it's expensive. And you can see why companies, it's a massive project to update, and why the exposure is there, because it's not an easy task to fix. And then on top of all of this, in March of 2020, we just said, okay, everybody go home. And so all of our IT departments had built cybersecurity processes and controls to protect us in the office, had to quickly shift to amend those to folks working at home. And now they're in this process, and we see this at our own company, of hybrid. How do you balance efficiency and function with protective measures to make sure that we're keeping our company safe? When people are working at home, they're using sometimes unprotected Wi-Fi networks. They are sometimes using their personal computers and printers, and anything that's connected to the internet obviously can be hacked into. On top of that, we've heard about the Internet of Things for years. It's a popular buzzword, but we are seeing the interconnectedness of all of the things we use in our everyday world continue to grow. And factories and manufacturers have this built into all of their technology, with operating technology that allows them to function appropriately. And so with that is the exposure that can either be hacked into, or obviously the last bullet point is the human element. We're all human, and humans make mistakes. And as we'll see later in the presentation, humans make a lot of mistakes, and most of them come from human error. So Before we get into the threats, I think it's helpful to level set who are threat actors. And generally they're classified in 4 categories: nation states, and we'll get into some details on that in a bit. Activists, so retaliating on behalf of whatever issue that they're passionate about. Could be unpredictable. Generally is less sophisticated versus a nation state, which is organized, has funding, is motivated by a particular reason. Cyber criminals are financially motivated. It's a business to them at this point, and it's a growing business. If you think about CNA ransomware, $40 million, that was a big payday for that group. And then insiders, which can be either accidental, sometimes on purpose, usually destructive, and the sophistication of that varies. For those of us in financial services, generally, it's coming from these 2 categories, these last 2 categories, cyber criminals and insiders, although the nation state bucket is growing a bit. So just starting with the nation states, I went to, so on the government's website, CISA is one of the government's IT departments. Off the top of my head, can't tell you what it stands for, but I will get back to you on that. And they explicitly list these 4 countries and their motivations for engaging in malicious cyber activities. There's a icon for each country. You can click into it. It's fascinating. I tried to recap at a high level to outline what their motivations are, but it's business for these countries as well as a modern form of warfare and espionage. So China, we can briefly go through these, uses it to pursue their national interests, including gaining competitive information, whether it's on how we build and manufacture the products that we sell in the US, or whether it's research, scientific or medical research. And you can see here, I don't think there's an industry that's not listed in that list after China. Russia, on the other hand, is usually motivated to suppress certain social or political activity that disagrees with their own interests, and they want to harm adversaries. And then it's also similar to China, steal intellectual property. North Korea is an interesting one because it's a highly sanctioned country, therefore really isolated, and they have to find a way to make money to feed their people. And they've turned to criminal activities, right? Whether it's cyber threats or being involved in drug trade, they are using this as a way to generate revenue for their country. And then Iran, on the other hand, it is very sophisticated in their capabilities, generally suppressing political or social activity that disagrees with them and harming their adversaries. For the financial, so the Verizon data breach investigations report is a great report if you ever are looking for something to read on this topic, but they identify for financial and insurance industry that the motives are generally financial. And I understand that this doesn't add up to 100%. I took it right from the report. So, but that helps with understanding for those of us in business where the threat actors are coming from and what kind of information they're seeking. It's to make money. And generally the way that money is being made increasingly these days is through ransomware. A quick refresher on how ransomware works. So malicious software is used to block access to a computer system or data, often by encrypting your data or your programs. How do they get into your system? It's either through a malicious link or a malicious attachment embedded through a phishing email that one of your employees, and we'll get into that, the awareness of employees, clicks on the link and launches the malicious software into your system. So that's one avenue. A second is that when there's massive data breaches and your information gets stolen and you wonder who's actually using my username and password, what happens to that information is then packaged and resold on the internet, and they use credential blasting. So they'll take full list of credentials and they'll just keep trying to log in potentially through one of your portals on your website that allows you internal access to the company. So sometimes they just log in to get in. And once they're in your system, they start digging for information, and they use any information that they can use to help have a productive and profitable negotiation with you on the ransom. So they will search for, as I mentioned, insurance policies. They'll find out your bank statements. So if you, as you try to negotiate with the hacker and you say, I can't possibly pay a $20 million ransom. They say, well, actually, I have all your bank statements. I know you can pay that. And I know that you have an insurance policy with this is your limit. And so all that information is then used against you. So it's getting much more sophisticated. Oftentimes they'll use that data, either data that they've stolen from you to help negotiate them and threat to disclose it unless you pay the ransom. The ransom then payment is usually given in exchange for a crypto, is usually paid in cryptocurrency through a third-party provider. And then they give you a key to unlock your files. One thing to keep in mind is obviously you're working with cyber criminals, so they're criminals, and a key to decrypt your data or files doesn't necessarily always end up with you having full access to your system. And when you think about a ransomware or extortion event, the costs included isn't just paying that ransomware, it's any attempts that you made to restore from backup. If there's a loss of private PII, private personally identifiable information or health information, it could trigger breach notification laws in the US and lead to a bunch of additional expenses. And oftentimes you have to pay a third party to help you negotiate that. So it can be very costly. And in the event that your systems aren't restored, there's additional costs outside of insurance that you might need to pay to upgrade your systems, to replace systems that you're unable to unencrypt. So moving into the trends, obviously, this is profitable a business for them, and it continues to be the weapon of choice, and it's up considerably in the last few years. And they've gotten better with how they sell it. So as we think of ransomware as a service business model, there's the hackers that are really good at building this software, this malicious software. So they spend all of their time making software that then they can package up and resell to someone else who's going to pay to then use it and deploy it. And so they've actually bifurcated the business, and those that are good at coding it will code it, and those that are wanting to deploy it will pay for the use of that. And it's not just the malicious code you come with, it comes with training and reference materials. They provide the support around it, and it's become really professional. And for those criminals that are using and deploying this software, it's a low risk, high reward opportunity. They can blast it and see where it works. And at no risk to them. And if it works, then they end up making a considerable amount of money. So obviously this has resulted in a sharp spike in the number of ransomware attacks, as well as the costs associated with them. And we see that on the claims side. It's been snowballing in the last few years. So the average ransom amount topped 100,000, even for some small and medium-sized enterprises, which in the net diligence claim study is considered to be businesses with less than 2 billion in revenue. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a growing use of what they call a double tap attack, where they will encrypt your data and also steal it. So then they will use that stolen data as leverage to get you to pay the ransomware. And then eventually, if you don't pay or you do pay, they could use that data to then sell. So it's a double data breach and ransomware event combined, which is just great. And so what companies are exposed, and does the size of the company matter? No. We've really seen these incidence costs are rising for all companies of any sizes. And today it used to be, if you think back to the Target breach days, you'd think about it, this as being those major large companies. And now we're increasingly seeing this come from, especially the number of claims come from these smaller and medium-sized enterprises. There's a spelling error in there. So, oh no, it's just on my screen, sorry. So if you think about it, all companies have similar work landscapes, no matter what their size is. We all rely on the internet and email to conduct business. We have to store our data, whether it's on premises or off premises or in the cloud. We have similar setups, unless you have no internet or email footprint, which would be would be the exception these days. And so in addition to ransomware, these threat actors are using business email compromise and social engineering. So they will work, and that's when they would work hard to convince you or your employees that they're a legitimate client or colleague, convince you to either disclose private information or health information or anything that they could use as leverage, or wire them money. So it's oftentimes pretending to be the CEO or the CFO, convincing you to wire, or a client say, oh, actually I updated my bank account, send it to here. And they get in the middle of transactions to make it seem like it's legitimate to the company. And as I mentioned before, sometimes they're already in your system. So they've studied up, they've gone in your system, they've read your emails, they know everything about you. They're not just, you're not going to find in some of these sophisticated attacks, it's not going to be like your misspelled, email where you can easily recognize that it's a threat actor. They're getting very sophisticated, very smart. Obviously, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, the more that we can make ourselves aware of the risks, aware of the flags, the red flags on these transactions, and build in controls and processes to protect ourselves, especially anywhere where money's being exchanged or financial transactions are being made. And an example of that would be, I received an email from the CEO, Sally. I pick up the phone and I call Sally and say, Sally, I received this email. Is this you? And you do a second check, like a confirmation. And so a lot of accounting departments and cash management departments are building in those controls to make sure that it's not just, I received this and I want to jump and respond to it quickly because it's from the CEO or the CFO, and I want to be a good egg and a good employee. Say, wait a second, the controls and processes we put in place require, even for the highest person on the ladder, that we do a double check, and there's a control measure to check that. Any questions? All right. So the pandemic, among other things, has had a negative effect on cybercrime. And they took no break. These cyber criminals had no pity for the world during the pandemic, and they increased their activities. And they used a lot of the pandemic to help them. So in the early days with the CARES Act stimulus funds and the PPP loans and small business disaster loans, they used those terms and to cater their phishing and ransomware attacks to get people to click, whether it's requesting private information that they can use, or whether it's getting you to click on something and launch that malicious software into your system. As the vaccines rolled out, they began to take advantage of that, requesting funds up front, getting personal information, creating fraudulent advertisements with malware embedded, and that's called like adware, where you could just see on a web page you're on, you click on a link for an ad on the sidebar, and it launches malicious software into your system. Obviously, these threat actors weren't quiet before the pandemic, but and these trends had already started, but it's just accelerated through the pandemic as we're all at home, and they're taking advantage of us paying less attention, being busier. Obviously, everyone's stress levels are at an all-time high. And so looking into the rest of this year and beyond, you expect that the amounts demanded will continue to grow, as will punishment for noncompliance if they demand a ransomware and you decide to instead, and you have the ability to restore from backup, and you don't need to pay that ransomware and your systems are back up and running. If they've gone in and stolen your data in addition to locking it up, then they have the ability to use that as leverage to say, well, guess what? If you don't pay me, I'm going to disclose this data. So that's expected to continue. And they can denial of services where they would blast your website with tons of activity to shut it down. So they will punish you and disrupt your business in order to force you to make the payment, to make the threat go away. Healthcare sector's at risk as we're treating patients, and that's the focus. And you have to make the payment in order to stay operational. And so we see this happening a lot in healthcare. You see it happening in law enforcement. There's a bunch, if you Google it, there's a ton of local police departments that have had to pay because you need these functions to be operational to provide and protect your citizens. And without the ability to access your data and systems, you can't provide this function. As I mentioned, the use of commonly used platforms is an exposure. There's a few companies that many of us or all of us use. And when threat actors are able to take advantage of errors in the software, or they can target many people at the same time. So again, back to that low risk, high reward type activity, a commonly used application provides that avenue. And then attacks on our key infrastructure like Colonial Pipeline is a key concern. So, and I'll get later in the presentation what the government's very aware of that and what they're starting to do about that. So we're going to increasingly see the government and private companies start focusing on those critical infrastructure, whether it's water, whether it's electricity, whether it's gas, whether anything that public type utility that might be privatized that benefits the greater good. So we have all these threats. Some are sophisticated, some are not. And then what's a company to do? NIST is another government organization, which I'm sure you may have heard of this structure, but they provide this structure which can be used for companies large and small to protect themselves. And it's this framework of identify your exposures and your controls that protect you, build those policies and procedures, protect yourself by patching your systems, upgrading whenever possible, encrypting your sensitive data, training your employees. You have to have the ability to detect it. So you need to be able to know when threat actors are in your system so that you can respond. And then when you have an incident, how you respond can make a substantial difference, not only from reducing the overall expense related to the incident, but also in your dealings with regulators and the government, and how you respond is really important. And then at the end, how do you recover? How do you get back up and running? And examples like CNA, for example, they were out for 2 weeks before they finally decided to pay the ransom because they tried to restore from backup. And that's what many companies do, is before you even start to negotiate, you're going to say, like, let me see if I can fix this myself. But then you reach a point where you need to function as a business, and companies are faced with that difficult decision. So earlier I talked a little bit about the human element, and I found this interesting research paper. It was conducted by Stanford University and then a security firm, Tessian. And they say that 88% of today's data breaches are caused by human error. And how does this happen? People are clicking on phishing emails. They're sending emails to the wrong person. I'm guilty of that. And they're making mistakes at work that compromised cybersecurity. And why is that happening? And I mentioned this, we're all tired and stressed. We're distracted, whether it's working from home or even distracted in the office. And our jobs, what we're getting paid for isn't cybersecurity, right? We all have different functions, and we're trying to work hard and be efficient and be productive and make money for our company, hopefully ourselves. And we're not thinking about cybersecurity. And so I liked this quote: distraction, stress, and fatigue influence people's ability to consistently make good cybersecurity decisions. And the events of 2020 have highlighted this, and obviously so have the claims trends that we've seen. And so companies are especially cybersecurity departments are faced with this struggle to balance the ease of doing business and meeting our customers' needs, being efficient and low cost in how we run our business, with the security measures that are vital to protect the data of our trade secrets of our company, the data of our associates, data of our clients, data of our clients' clients. We all, as companies, hold a ton of data these days, and we have to protect it and respond to these growing threats. I thought this was really interesting from that same study. On the left side, I've clicked on a phishing email and then what industry they're based in. So leading it is technology, which is interesting, and financial services. The sectors that you would think would be more sophisticated about this topic are the top clickers. And then you have business consulting followed by healthcare, followed by retail. And then on the right side, the right graph is I'm expected to reply to emails quickly. And again, you kind of see a similar lineup. Technology is higher at 85%, say that of the people that respond to the survey say they're expected to reply to emails quickly. Financial services, business consulting, healthcare, and retail. So as we're moving quick in our jobs and we have a lot to do, it's a more complex working environment as we're all trying to figure out this new way of working. And we're moving too quickly, we're tired and distracted and stressed. We click on things. And so it makes sense when I saw this graph, like how 88% of these breaches are related to human error. So what can we do as companies, in addition to setting up the right framework, like I talked about with NIST? Security and awareness is one of the biggest deterrents to these events. And the Verizon report also says that for the financial and insurance sector, the best protective controls we can do are awareness and skills training, configure our enterprise assets to be secure, and then control who has access to what information. And so training your employees to recognize the signs and then testing them on that knowledge is vital. And so what we do, I'll talk about what we do at our company, is we send out these test phishing and campaigns. I'm sure many of you do at your companies too. It annoys people greatly, but honestly, I selfishly don't feel bad because it's the good guys have to get it right every time, and the bad guys only have to get it right once. So the more we get our employees trained to recognize those signs and avoid it, because all it takes is one click, and we want to avoid that. So what we do is we do a regular cadence of these phishing email campaigns. And then the people that are clickers or habitual clickers, we start targeting them. So if you click once, you start getting more tests. You continue to click, then we accelerate that. And oftentimes it can lead to one-on-one training with our cybersecurity team. And eventually we're gonna have to figure out what you do with people that just continue to click, because it's honestly, it can be akin to just leaving the doors wide open with like your bank account statements just sitting there and all your passwords to the company. But I get why it happens. We're all moving really fast and trying to work hard. And we're not always thinking about cybersecurity. So we test them, we target the clickers, and we test them again, and then we just keep going. And so one of the things too that we get a lot is threat actors that it's our busy season. Can you just stop this? And one of our responses is, the hackers who are real, these aren't made up threats, aren't waiting for your busy season to be over. And actually that's the best time for them to come find you. And as I said, the best targets are those that are tired and distracted. On the access control management, this is really the principle of least privilege. So as every employee, we have various systems and shared drives in everyone's company. It's really restricting people's access to only what they need for their job function. So the less people that have admin privileges and can access multiple systems and have kind of like high access rights, the better it is for a company. Because if that password gets compromised in some data breach and they can log in as one person who is an admin, and then they have the keys to the whole house. So that's something that companies, it's obviously a work in progress and takes a lot of updating, but something that companies are working on. And then obviously cyber insurance provides a valuable protection for companies. And so when I think about cyber insurance, I kind of think I want to talk about it in two buckets. So affirmative cyber products, which I'll talk about right now, and then I'll talk about what we think of as silent cyber or non-affirmative cyber and what that means. So affirmative cyber really grew out of the early 2000s. California passed its data breach or data privacy law, and then there started to be an acceleration of products offered to protect that. And it started with responding to the data breach, whether it's credit monitoring or helping you respond to it, notifying affected individuals. And it's since grown. And obviously this is not a complete list. Every company has additional coverages. Every company calls them something completely different. Try to keep it with general terms, but it's since grown to pick up your liability from your customers or whoever's data you're holding. If there's a breach, regulatory fines and penalties, payment card industry, so fines that are coming from MasterCard or Visa relative to your master service agreement you have with them, business interruption, information security liability. That's if you or your associates or your computer system unknowingly participates or you pass on a virus to somebody else and you have liability for that. Extortion, ransomware, we talked about, obviously. Data restoration, so in the event that a hacker comes in and deletes or destroys or augments your data to help you pay to restore that data to what it was previously. Website media liability, which is really kind of an extension of a GL coverage to pick up any violations of your trademark or anything on the web. And then obviously there's a full list of coverages. So social engineering, that business email compromise, if there's a fraudulent funds and I'm convinced to send to a different bank account, there's reimbursement for that. There's ID theft, there's bricking, which would be the replacement of like hardware, like laptops. If they make your laptop or your phones unusable, the cost to replace that. Utility interruption, so there's a hack on a utility provider or any type of service provider. Could you have, like, it's almost like a contingent BI, a coverage for that at your location? And so looking back a couple of years ago on the affirmative cyber side, coverages were moving really fast. It was like, who can have the best, jazziest coverage with the highest limits? And that's come to a screeching halt in the last couple of years because the resulting cyber risk, the exposures are growing and therefore claims are rising. And a few years ago, cyber was really seen as, by some companies and some carriers, as a diversifying line of insurance to help you. So it was really a part of your wider portfolio. It wasn't expected to be noisy. It was performing well. And that's really changed. And it's moved to the front of the line for managers to be concerned about, whether it's from their aggregation or their ability to purchase protection, whether it be reinsurance or retro on the exposure. And so there has been, with the growing exposures and the rising claims, there's been an adjustment to coverage. In particular, we see shrinking limits. We see some sublimits that had been previously removed coming back into the game, especially in regards to ransomware. And I think we expect that to continue to happen. There's always the disconnect between what's in the media and then what's actually in the policy, but that seems to be the direction that the trend is going. And then premiums are obviously following suit. I wouldn't say that the premiums are yet at the point where it's making it a profitable line. It's really about catch up right now. So we had a decade of great years, and now we've experienced some pretty awful and not so great years. So how do we catch up, and what's the appropriate rate as we think about cyber in particular, where aggregation is not limited by geographical boundaries or regions? It's not like a NatCat that you can expect is going to hit these states or these countries or are impacted by the various laws. Cyber is a global coverage by the nature of where these threats are coming from and where the data is going. So in contrast to affirmative cyber, we have what is called silent cyber. And this is related to potential cyber-related losses on traditional property and casualty and other lines of business that are not specifically designed to cover cyber. Why is this a concern? Obviously, the concern is because as insurance companies, we haven't priced for the exposure. We haven't enough times even considered it or thought about the aggregation from it. And for the insured, there's a lack of clarity over what they're paying for. And in the event that they have an event, what indemnification they're going to have from their carrier. That is moving and changing. In 2019, the UK regulator, the PRA, requested that insurers clarify if coverage is provided for cyber events. So they really want you to say explicitly, this policy offers coverage, or this policy does not offer coverage. And that we've seen the market move to tighten up that wording, and it's taken a bit, but now that is really starting to flow through through the US. So in the US, our industry and abroad has responded where people are working to clarify intent by either excluding or confirming that cyber insurance is covered. And examples of that include ISO on their property coverage form. They have a cyber incident exclusion endorsement. The London market has various wording that they include. And then ISO also created a CGL endorsement called access or disclosure of confidential or personal information and data related liability with limited bodily injury exception. That's a long one. And these ISO ones in particular are mandatory endorsements. And I expect that's going to continue to develop, whether it's on just limited to property and liability or whether it extends to other lines of business. I think that companies are looking for clarity and they're starting to be very concerned with aggregation, and regulators are looking for clarity on behalf of the policyholders. So I expect that will continue to develop. And as I mentioned, the government's responding. So this is just a list of things that have happened since May. So there was an executive order issued on improving cybersecurity. Congress had inquiries into the CNA and Colonial Pipeline attacks. There was a memo issued to the private sector on the risks and exposures of ransomware. And then, as I mentioned, with the majority of the US's infrastructure privatized, there's a concern of how do we protect our national interests, and especially related to critical infrastructure. And so there was a national security memorandum called Improving Cybersecurity for Critical Infrastructure Control Systems, which outlines a framework and expectations of these companies to protect and protect their systems and the functions that they perform. And then additionally, the president's been engaging with private sectors and education and academia on how to address these threats. And the bipartisan infrastructure bill that was just passed includes $1 billion to help local state governments deter and protect themselves from cyber attacks and modernize their systems. It includes $100 million to increase our government's ability to respond to major events. And then there's a new office of the National Cyber Director. And then additionally, with the infrastructure, there is additional funding, and it's about to make our system and our infrastructure more resilient. And it includes obviously from natural catastrophes, like protecting from drought and floods, but also protecting ourselves from cyber attack. And I hope that it starts to direct these companies, especially related to our infrastructure, to think about cybersecurity protection in the same vein that they think about protecting you from any physical elements from the environment. That it's vital. It can potentially cause more damage and outage, and it needs to be protected. So we're getting near the end, but so if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask, but one of the noisiest parts recently coming out of the government is related to the Office of Foreign Asset Control, so OFAC. And I'm going to rewind from the slide a year prior. So in October of 2020, OFAC released an advisory on potential sanctions risks for facilitating ransomware payments. At the time, it was clarified it's not changing the policy, it's just reminding you in particular of this exposure. So that was October 2020. In September of this year, they released an updated ransomware advisory bulletin called Updated Advisory on Potential Sanctions Risks for Facilitating Ransomware Payments. Again, it doesn't create a new rule or regulation, but it very loudly and clearly highlights the sanctions risks exposed with facilitating a ransomware payment and identifies the parties that OFAC is paying attention to. So some highlights from the advisory. Obviously, we talked about this, ransomware is on the rise. Companies that facilitate ransomware payments on behalf of cyber victims, including financial institutions like banks, cyber insurance firms, which would include cyber insurance companies, or any insurance company, insurance brokers, insurance agents, anyone involved in the entire chain. It says that when you are helping to facilitate that payment, and whether it's getting involved in the forensics or negotiations or responding to the incident, you have a risk of potentially violating OFAC's regulations. And OFAC and the government in general, obviously, there's a old saying that the government doesn't pay ransoms, encourages you instead of paying ransoms to spend your money to build a more robust and protected cybersecurity program to protect your assets. They haven't gone to the measure of saying that it's against the law to pay ransom, but it outlines that there are many cyber actors and nation states, some of which we covered at the beginning, that are a part of their sanctions program. And it includes both those who are conducting the threats, as well as those that are facilitating the payments. So when we did that earlier slide on a ransomware refresher, obviously, if you have a ransomware event, you don't know the first thing about, I wouldn't know the first thing about making a ransomware payment. You would seek out a third party who would help you negotiate the ransomware, help you arrange to buy whatever cryptocurrency they're demanding payment in, and to make that payment. So obviously not all those third parties are on the right side of the line, and sometimes they're working with the cyber criminals. So those types of individuals or organizations could also be included in that sanction designation list. And in the event that something happens, OFAC strongly encourages that you cooperate with OFAC and any law enforcement, including reporting if you have a ransomware event. And then if you accidentally paid somebody that's a sanctioned individual, that you disclose that as soon as possible. So why does that matter to all of us? US persons, so as US persons, we are prohibited from engaging in transactions, whether it's directly or indirectly, with sanctioned individuals, entities, countries, regions. And that includes having a non-US person facilitate something on your behalf. So if as for my company, as a global organization, all of us, like if we're based in the US, we're all subject to that sanctions and OFAC's regulations. We can't just have an international entity do something. It doesn't avoid the issue. And OFAC can pose civil penalties, so to all of us as individuals, based on strict liability, and you can be held civilly liable even if you didn't know that you were engaged in a transaction that violated a trade sanction. So it doesn't have to be a knowing decision. It can be as a result of not having a good compliance program or process in place to ensure that you tried not to pay a sanctioned individual. As part of that, when we think about a compliance system, we think about that before we make any payments, we're checking a sanctioned list to make sure that those individuals or organizations or people aren't from a sanctioned country or region, that we are building in protections and controls in our organization to try to restrict and prohibit the ability to pay one of those sanctioned parties. And in particular, a few years ago, and this is related to global coverages, which by the nature of the product, cyber would now, I would consider it a global cover, said that a few years ago in an FAQ to insurers, that the best and most reliable approach for ensuring global risks without violating trade sanctions law is to insert an explicit exclusion for risks that would violate trade sanctions. The legal effect of this is to shift the risk of loss from the underlying transaction back to the insured. It's the person that has the direct control over making that payment and direct control over the economic activity that gave rise to the risk. And so with that, we would say, as part of building your robust compliance program to ensure that you're not paying sanctioned people, that you strongly consider in your primary policy, you have ransomware coverage, that you include a sanctions exclusion, to say that I explicitly am saying in my primary policy that I'm not going to pay a sanctioned individual, or and we have recommended wording if you have any questions. Of course.
You run as fast as your hair grows. So, Molly, how long until you think a threat actor operating in a sanctioned country realizes that they can no longer get insurance payments for what they're doing just moves to another country. I mean, as savvy as they are, I can't, I mean, I just think that would be something they would do pretty quickly.
Yeah, I don't think they have to move to another country. So what they do is they know, obviously, that their organization or their country is on the sanctioned list. They work really hard to disguise themselves. And it's really, really difficult to distinguish one criminal from a sanctioned criminal. And so, yeah, it's a challenge for sure. And so I don't think they have to move countries. I think they're already working hard to disguise themselves. One of the things, I was on a industry WebEx 2 weeks ago, and the FBI presented. And so there was a number of questions directly about OFAC to the FBI, and the FBI gave their like government response, which was like, go to OFAC's website. Like, you know, like I can't answer on behalf of another department. But at the end of it, the agent finally gave sort of a little bit of a glimpse into his personal opinion. And he said, honestly, I think that sanctions are only one of the tools in the toolbox that the government's going to use, but I don't think that'll continue to be the only tool. And so I don't know if that eventually means that paying a ransom becomes illegal. I don't know what I'm sure there's a number of measures that they're considering, but yeah, it'll be interesting, especially as it continues to grow, because if you think about it, when you're paying a ransomware, you're keeping these criminals in business, right? And so OFAC is one avenue of sanctioned individuals, but they could go down other routes of regulations related to money laundering or whatever the government chooses. I think this will develop over the next couple of years, is my personal opinion, but right now it's not illegal.
Well, would the fines and penalties associated with violating those sanctions be the same, even if it was a disguised threat actor? There's no relief for that, is there?
Yeah, so what I will say is that the better that you present yourself, so meaning if you have a compliance program in place to say like, I'm trying to avoid doing this, and if you accidentally make a payment, that you immediately involve law enforcement and OFAC, that they were aware when the incident first happened, that they've been involved. Like, the better you cooperate and share information, I think that I can imagine that might benefit you when it comes to paying fines. But I truly don't think fines are unavoidable at all. I think that the amount is depending on the situation, but really, I don't think there's any way to avoid a fine in my brief knowledge on the topic. That's the end of my presentation. So if there's any other questions, I'm happy to take them.
Well, Molly, you had the unenvious
Yeah.
position of being the last speaker of the day, and I'm sure people need to start moving on, but thank you so much for your presentation, full of information. For the folks at home as well as here, all the presentations will be available on the PAMIC website, probably as early as tomorrow or Friday. So you'll be able to get access to them as well. Once again, just remind me, if you need your CE credits, make sure you sign out. For those who need them on that are attending virtually, you've already met your requirements through the polling. And on behalf of PAMIC and its members and its employees, please have a safe, wonderful Thanksgiving. Travel safely if you're going anywhere, as well as tonight on your way home. So with that, have a good evening, and I hope to see you soon.